Hey everyone, Kyle here, Climbing Majority. First off, just want to thank you all for subscribing and listening to our podcast. We've also been seeing great reviews and ratings start to pop up on Spotify and Apple. This means so much to us and helps keep the fire going for this project. If you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. In this episode, we sit down and talk with AMGA guide Joshua Reinig. I met Josh about 7 years ago when I first started climbing. His immediate willingness to share his knowledge and stoke helped shape me into the climber that I am today. Throughout his climbing career, Josh has led over 6,000 guided trips, established over 2,000 first ascents, and is currently in the top 25 all-time contributors to Mountain Project. His deep excitement for climbing and passion for sharing it is a contagious energy to everyone around him. In this 2.5-hour conversation, we talk about Josh's past and how he came to be an AMGA guide, involving a freak accident that almost cost him his life. We dive deep into what it means to be a mentor, explain how to manage fear and risk, go over the ethics behind the creation of first ascents, and finally, talk about Josh's most recent undertaking, the creation of the Mount Whitney Climbing Ranch. All right, so the accident, we're talking about where you were mentally at this time. Kind of talk to us a little bit about who you were as a climber as you were approaching this moment. I'd like to kind of hear where you're at in your career at this point.
Yes. So, and I think that's very important so people understand where I'm coming from with sharing this. So before I say that, what I was starting to say is that I do think we learn more from failure than success, right? And that's been a big part of my healing process through all of this and a lot of other traumatic events that I've experienced in my life. As harsh of maybe a reality as that can be to come to sometimes, this was one of the best learning experiences I've ever been through. Not only that, I've only ever maybe told this story to 20 people total. And it happened 20 years ago, so on average once a year. Okay. It's not something that I like to share faintly, and it has been a bit of a build-up coming into this. So at the very least, out of all of this podcast, if anybody that is listening can learn from this lesson, but I try to tell it in somewhat of a parody, right? Paradoxical. Yeah. Yeah, whatever I'm trying to say. Like I guess sugarcoated a little bit. Okay. So where I was coming from with my climbing was at this point, I've been climbing 5 years, like almost nonstop. And I definitely was like at the top of my game up until that point. Um, had done a lot of bigger objectives, like started to climb quite a bit at Talkeeds, which is one of the earlier, like more multi-pitch alpine crags that I cut my teeth at. Had done some stuff in the Sierra, um, but still went on to do way bigger things, which has always been very interesting that I got past this episode of my life, right?
Where are you at in terms of grades? What are you comfortable on-siting? What's your relationship with risk and running it out? Like, kind of describe that part of the climbing experience.
Thank you, I will. So I've always had a huge tolerance for risk and a high threshold for pain. Um, the whole psychological breakdown as far as risk management, I didn't know any of that at the time. All I knew was just my instincts based off of all of the past mountain experiences I had. Okay. Which I felt at that time I was pretty damn competent. Okay. I'd even done like my first real big trip to Yosemite, which was a huge success. But still a relatively new climber. But the difference I would say with like maybe somebody that we see 5 years into it at this point, and they are that dedicated, is a lot of that experience was coming out of a gym without a lot of formal training or maybe even some formal foundation, right? Which I think almost the whole community understands the foundation right out of the gates now, which is huge. Gyms did not exist at this time. They did, but there was like one in California and it was way too far away. No mentors. The only guide was Bob Gaines out of Joshua Tree. He wasn't very approachable, and nor could like 19-year-old me afford his rates. So my brother and I, at this point, were essentially 100% self-taught from Freedom of the Hills. Okay. And even for a while after that. And this was an interesting learning experience. I remember after it happened, I read a bunch of logistics. And one of them was like, hey, if you haven't experienced a serious accident 5 years into doing the serious, you'll probably go your whole career and nothing will happen. But then you'll eventually get complacent and it could catch up with you. Right. And I'm like, wow, well, I didn't fall into those logistics. This happened to me after 5 years into it. Right. Most serious accidents, it was like within the first 3 years. Obviously, all of those numbers have changed because of the introduction of gyms and the very healthy influx, let's say, to this community. Paint a little bit more of a picture. Like I remember going to Joshua Tree for my first time for a 15-day trip, and we saw one other climbing team the entire time. And that was in like 2001. It was neat because I kind of got to experience both sides of like the last kind of generation of era of climbing, at least for California, into what it now is. So yeah, dating myself a little bit, which that's fun. But so that's kind of where I was at with all of this. But to to take it a step further, it was way too early on to be developing routes, and that's where this all occurred. Um, I didn't really get into route development seriously until I'd been climbing for like 10 to 12 years. And we can get to that. But out of necessity, we lived in North County, San Diego at the time. There are a few local crags, but there was this bitchin' spot that was closer to home that was undeveloped. There's some really unique history there. Um, it's on kind of one side of the mountain, and and you're not allowed to go there anymore because it's privately owned by some climbers. So we're like, wow, the other side of the mountain is even better. And there's a cliff that's like, 20 yards off the road, and we developed 6 routes on it, placed the very first bolts I'd ever placed and hand drilled them for this one TR. And we went there for a couple of years, and all was good. But then we started like the mountain's huge. It's covered in a lot of giant boulders and crags. So after about a year, we decided to go up to this next terrace that looks promising. And we'd gone up there once to scope it, and it was my brother and I. And then we had just recently befriended this kid that was fresh out of the Air Force. He was a friend of a friend, super cool guy. He had just gotten back from doing like 3 tours to Afghanistan, and he was an Air Force medic. So he was definitely PTSD, right? And a little, climbing was very good for him. Let's put it that way. And he came out of his bubble right away. So we climbed with him for a little bit, and then we're like, hey, we have this new spot. You should go check it out. It's even closer to your house. So it's like, yeah, okay, game on. It's New Year's Day is when we plan to go up there. And weather's supposed to be nice, but what ends up happening is that night it just downpoured all night long. So we didn't get a lot of sleep. We woke up in the morning and like, well, it's beautiful out now, but the ground's a little wet. We're like, oh, let's still go out there. The rock will dry fast. So we head out. We scramble to like 20 to 50 yards up to that first crag, do a couple of those climbs to show our buddy. And then it's like, okay, I think we had our hand drill and a couple bolts, but we knew we could build trad anchors at this new upper terrace. And so we scramble around to that. And at, like I mentioned, we'd been up there before. So what happens is it's a very steep mountainside, Southern California chaparral, which is like a nightmare to navigate through. And to kind of avoid the bushwhacking, there was like this beautiful giant, like 5-story boulder with this perfect catwalk ledge that split like halfway out horizontally. Like, thank God, ledge. And you could kind of bushwhack up the right side up this ravine to get to that ledge, traverse out it, and then you did like 20 feet of this like 5th class slab to get to this terrace we were developing. And then it just so happens, and like I said, we had done it before. It was pretty chill, but like at that point, you're definitely in a no fall zone, like 50 feet up, right? And it's in a chaparral with a bunch of talus underneath it. Um, but then kind of you could block the exposure out, especially without having a rope. That to the right of you, you're right off of this ravine. You've just bushwhacked up. You could, in theory, maybe jump that way and go like 20 feet and land in a bunch of bushes, which still wouldn't be good. But then the kicker is right when that ledge ends and you're like, okay, I don't want to fall to the left. And you have to do that like 20 feet of like 5-0 slab, which we had done in our approach shoes before. I'm in my approach shoes again. I have a huge pack on. The rock's a little wet. There's like a mini refrigerator size block that we estimated to be at least a ton, if not more, that was just balancing there. Very obvious separate entity. And I felt like I was pretty good about, as far as risk mitigation, like identifying loose rock for sure. And I'd climbed in alpine environments. So I felt like I could translate that a little bit. My buddy, however, that's new to this, oblivious to that, right? So my brother goes out first. I get out there and I'm basically looking up at the 5-0 move. My buddy's starting out the ledge and I'm like straddling around that big boulder, not touching it at all. And I look back at him and I say, hey, this is the boulder. Like, even though it's kind of leaning against the wall, like, don't touch it. Like, you don't have to, like, even standing on this, it might go. So you have to commit to these moves around it. And as I'm saying that, it literally just pops like a ghost pushes it off on me. And I start free falling. Everything goes super slow time lapse, like so slow mo. And this being 20 years ago, I can still relive it. Like every time I think about it or every time I tell the story, it's like that permanently ingrained in my psyche now. And instantly I go into like the flying V. So like I'm upside down and this thing's like above my torso. I'm like hugging it and I'm like lights out. Like it was like definitely one of the closest life flash before my eyes moments I've ever had. And I've had a few in this now, unfortunately, and knock on wood. Which those are the other ones were also kind of freak events. And I'll come back to that as well. But I'm like, maybe a couple seconds. It just feels like an eternity as I'm falling with this thing. And it's just like freeze frame. And last ditch effort, um, I'm like, fuck, I have to try to get out from underneath it. So I push as hard as I can, like right as it feels like I'm about to impact the ground. And all of a sudden, everything rotates and I'm surfing on it like the fucking Wile E. Coyote. And in my mind, I was like, no fucking shit, like that worked. And I'm like, okay, impact, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, jump. And as I do that and I go to jump, um, the whole thing just goes whoop back over me above my torso, impact into the ground. Luckily, it doesn't crush me or I wouldn't be here. And it would have totally like just crushed me like a pancake. But what it does do is it throttles onto my leg, pins me in a bunch of talus. I never lost consciousness. And it feels like my leg is basically torn off. And my first reaction was try to move it. And I can't. And I hear my buddy ripping down through the chaparral and he comes running up and he goes to the downhill side of me and he gets way nervous and all pale white. And that makes me nervous because I'm like, I know, I know my buddy's seen some traumatic stuff in the military and like being a medic, like I said. And he's like, dude, we have to get this rock off you. We have to get this rock off of you. And it's kind of like, yeah, no shit. And I'm already thinking like, we can't do it by ourselves. Like my brother needs to come down. My brother's up there waiting. He still doesn't know this has happened. So we start yelling like blood curdling screams. I hear my brother ripping down through some chaparral. And as we hear him running down, me and my buddy try. We go 1, 2, 3, and we barely get it up an inch just to have it like fall back onto me.
Oh,
And my brother comes running up, and his first look, like I'll never forget. And he's just like, I think he even says, like, "You dumb fuck, what the fuck did you do?" And I'm just like, "It wasn't me, man. Like it just went on its own." And he's just like looks dumbfounded, which it takes a lot to kind of like appall my brother, you could say. Like he's a pretty straight faced individual, and it doesn't take a lot to surprise him, which is always fun because I know when he's like showing some excitement on a pitch, I'm like, oh, what the fuck is this going to be like? When normally he's like way calm, cool, and collected, right? So he's like, you guys couldn't get it off? Like looking at it like we couldn't get it off on our own. What the fuck? And it's like, no. So we're like, okay, count of three. 1, 2, 3. We all roll it. It flops down onto the hillside. My buddy and my brother on the downhill side. So like they're trying to stay out of the way to where it doesn't roll onto them. And all I see is I don't see a foot there. I just see bloody stump with my tib and fib sticking out.
Oh.
And then my foot's dangling and my toes are touching like the back of my calf right here. And
Oh.
so basically like severed foot, but it's still attached by something, I can't tell. And I get way nauseous, but I still don't pass out. My buddy's like, we have to stop the bleeding. And in that instance, it's just arterial bleeding down his face and all over his white shirt. And he gets all trembly. And then my brother like kind of like holds him and he's like, no, dude, like, let's do this. And he goes, we have to reset it. We have to reset it. So he grabs my foot, pulls it all the way down. And I'm like, what the hell is it even still connected to? And it goes thump back into place. So what it was still attached to was just my Achilles tendon. Um, but now, like, it doesn't want to stay. It's flopping and they're trying to hold it. They pressure up the fuck out of it. And he's like, I don't want to tourniquet it yet, even though like I can't say anything. And just shy of getting ready to tourniquet it, just from pressure holding it, they get the bleeding to stop. But at that point, and I hadn't had any formal medical training yet, which obviously being guides, we have to have quite a bit now. Um, Looking back, like solid 2 liters of blood on the ground. So I was
Oh
definitely
my
going
God.
way into compensatory shock. And I get super cold and shaky. Everything feels very euphoric. Um, they're like, we have to get you out of the mountain. So although the approach to that lower crag was 20 yards, we were about a half mile up from that. But then that's kind of from like the end of this dirt road. Our car was 4 miles away. And so my buddy, they're like, yeah, how are we going to extract you? And like, you need to be at the hospital now. Like, you're kind of like, you're dying. And I'm just sitting there like, no, like, you guys got this. I'm not dying. When biologically, like my buddy was already shutting down. Right. And, my friend, he like out of nowhere, he goes, like I had just gotten my first cell phone ever. This was in 2001. And it was like a Nokia phone. I got it for work and it was like I called it my electronic leash because my boss would like call me like at 1 a.m. and shit or text me. And so I kind of didn't really like cell phones. I didn't have mine on me. Then my buddy goes, I just got this new Motorola flip phone that was military issued just before I left. And I was supposed to have given it back, but I think it's in my pack. And we're like, fuck, okay, call 911. And he goes, no, better yet, like, there's this thing, it's called the GPS function. And it was almost at that time the same as having like an inReach. And he just hit this distress button and it sent a distress code to Camp Pendleton, which was the nearest military base. And
Wow.
he goes, dude, if this works and it looks like the signal went out, they'll send their search and rescue and it'll be here in 10 minutes. And I'm like, no fucking way, right? And at this point, I was pretty young. I lived a pretty simple life, you could say, up to that point. I'd never flown in my life. And he's saying like, "Oh, a helicopter is gonna come and pluck you off the mountain." I'm like, "What the fuck? This is what it's gonna be like my first time flying now too." And yeah, and sure enough, I think it was 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes max. I hear rotor blades, and this like old military Huey, like out of an old Vietnam movie, appears. And I'm like, no fucking way. And drop a rope out of it. They spot us, they drop a rope out, and this dude in full fatigues, like body wrap repels out of the helicopter. And in my weird mindset at that time, he looks like LL Cool J, but fully like cammied out and everything. Just no firearms or anything, right? I'm like, what the fuck? Like LL Cool J came to rescue me. And the guy had this like very similar like mannerisms and everything. And he does say like, boys, what the fuck did you guys get yourself into? And he just looks dumbfounded. And he's like, why are you way up on this mountainside? Like, you didn't get it. And we're like, oh, we're up here rock climbing. And he's just like looking around like oblivious. And but way stoked. Like that guy lived the essence, I think, of adventure for sure, even though I got to know him a little bit afterwards. But from a rescue and like trying to make somebody feel comfortable was a master. And I didn't know that at the time to what extent. And I'll get to that in the story. But he's like, he goes, all my rescues, he goes, I bring a disposable camera. Can I get a bunch of photos? And I'm like, are you serious? And he
Wow.
busts out a little waterproof disposable camera, takes all these photos, and then he mailed them to me later. So I have all those photos. I can share them with you guys later. And
Wow.
he's like, all right. It's like your buddy reset your foot from what it sounds like he did part of my job. He's like, you got the bleeding to stop, and he's like, you did lose a lot of blood. And as he's telling me this, it's kind of this weird bedside manner. He's like, so, have you ever had morphine before? And I'm just thinking, like, what are you even talking about? And he slams me with a needle, and he goes, don't worry, all the pain will be gone now. He's like, but the bad thing is you're now addicted to morphine. And I'm just like, dude, you sick fuck, right? And he's like, oh, and he's all stoked. He's like, check this out. And he pulls out an inflatable cast or an inflatable splint. It was like when they first came out, and throws that thing on my leg, has a CO2 cartridge to just instantly inflate it. And he goes, you're good to go. And he's like, you ever ridden in a helicopter before? I'm like, no, I've never flown. And he just kind of laughs. And he goes, all right, well, we can do this one of two ways. And I had my harness on, which was weird because my pack was so full. I put my harness on, which I like don't almost ever do like in those settings, right? And he goes, I'm gonna give the chopper pilot will come back. I'll give him the signal. He's gonna lower this like 500-foot winch and it's cable, and I can clip you right into your harness, and he'll fly you up to about 5,000 feet. They'll winch you in, and you'll be to the hospital in like 10 or 15 minutes, and probably straight into surgery. And I'm like, okay, yeah. I'm like, what's the other option? Oh, and he goes, and I'll walk out of here with your two bonehead friends. I'm like, well, what's the other option? And he goes, I give that signal, the pilot lowers the winch, and I'll clip us both in, and I'll get the fuck off this mountain with you, and they can fend for themselves. And I'm like, and now I'm all high on morphine. I'm like, dude, like, you're the professional, like, it's up to you. And he goes, yeah, we're both getting off this mountain then together. And he's like, yeah, I'll make you feel like more comfortable that you've never flown. And I'm like, yeah, no, that sounds great. So Chopper comes back. My brother and our friend are like tripping, but like kind of a sigh of relief now, right? Like everything's gonna be okay. At least that was like my feeling of the whole situation. But this is when it gets bad. Okay. So Chopper pilot lowers the cable. It's a Petzl 3-stage ball lock on the end of that thing. I remember this day. I'm like, no shit. Like, you think you guys have something like all steel or something heavier duty? And he clips us both into like my belay loop and his belay loop. He's got like a CETA harness on, and gives a signal, and helicopter takes off, and we're like 5,000 feet. And I'm like, whoa, this is, and so exposed on this ridge side. And he's like, I feel the cable. He's like, all right, yeah, they're stable. They're gonna winch us in, and the guy looks all stoked. He's like still taking some photos, and he, I like maybe 100 feet into the winch. It was like right out of like the best way I could describe it was like out of a movie. And those rotor blades, I hear them just go bump, 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 and stop. And that helicopter, like if helicopter's here and we're getting winched up, it disappears off the side of the mountain. Upside
Oh.
down. And that guy grabs me and he goes, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, what the fuck? And we get decked from 500 feet. And I was more or less sitting on his lap into a bunch of talus and chaparral. We bounce about 30 or 40 feet, land, and that guy took it like a brick. Like he was built like a linebacker. And I'm expecting this like internal fireball. And in that moment, I look at him and he's like panicked as hell, and he's trying to unclip us. And he's like, damn it. And I'm like, and instantly I'm like, oh, it's because we're about to get drugged now for who knows how long. And he grabs me again and he goes, hold on again. And we get drugged through the chaparral for probably 100 yards. Like rag dolls, like super cut up and everything. And now I'm expecting the eternal fireball. I'm like, fuck, like the helicopter crashed and we just got decked. And that's kind of the feeling I'm getting from him too. And then all of a sudden, we hear the rotor blade just go like kick up, like, and we're fucking instantly to like 5,000 feet again, like off this ridge side. And they winch us up and bring us in, and it's kind of all high fives. And they're like, fuck, we can't believe you got decked again. And I'm like, what do you mean again? And they explained to me that it's a very real risk with helicopter rescues, and that you were putting up to like 13 to 15 other individuals' lives at risk, and helicopters do go down all the time. And what happens, especially above 14,000 feet, is you don't get enough friction on the blades. You can hit like a dead pocket of air, they call it. It just loses all friction and lift, and the helicopter crashes. So that's what happened. But then this pilot, being this like seasoned vet he is, was able to recover and got us off the mountain.
So you fell and decked a ledge and got dragged to the talus, and then the helicopter restarted and pulled you
Yeah,
guys up.
yeah, exactly.
How did you survive a 500-foot deck?
I don't know. And all I could say is it felt slow motion. It was probably more similar to a soft catch as far as like
Okay.
taking a lead fall. But like I said, we bounced a solid 30 feet. Like I remember hitting the ground and bouncing way back up above like 20-foot chaparral and landing. So we obviously hit really
Jeez.
hard. I mean, to be honest, like he had to have been pretty sore the following days. I was so high on morphine, like I didn't really feel that impact. I remember it felt really jarring. What I did feel was when we got drug and how terrifying that was. And so then because that happened, they couldn't fly us straight to the immediate public hospital. They had to go back to Camp Pendleton land to fill out all these reports. In which case they said that a civilian ambulance would be waiting there for me and take me to another hospital. Although now all my family is on the way to this hospital they thought I was all getting flown to, right? And when we land on the tarmac, I remember all these flight crew come up, and it was all high fives and like beers, even though I don't think they were cracking beers. But that the gentleman that was my rescuer, and I can't for the life of me remember his name right now, he apparently holds the record for military search and rescue personnel for surviving being decked more times than anybody. That was his 7th time being decked in similar other fashions like that. And I was just like, what the hell, dude? Like, the guy was like, yeah, I mean, guardian angel that day, right? And what's
Wow.
funny was when he came and visited me in the ER, and when I was recovering, and gave me those photos, and the guy did look like LL Cool J. It was funny. I was like, okay, that wasn't me like imagining that in the moment, yeah. So that
wasn't just like serious shock taking
exactly,
over. Just,
yeah,
like, completely
for
done.
sure. And like I said, never lost consciousness. So I go into surgery immediately, and by this time it's 10 o'clock at night. Surgeon is like they do all these X-rays. Surgeon's kind of orthopedic surgeon, right? He's kind of baffled, and he calls in all these other like doctors and stuff, and they're like, yeah, this is extremely uncommon, but you didn't break a single bone. And
Whoa.
so it was what they called at the time an open dislocation of my tib and fib. So basically peeled my foot off. It was still attached by the Achilles, but then all of the tendons in my forefoot were all severed. And it was like 4 hours of surgery for them to go in and reattach them all.
And was the skin split so you could see the bone? The bone wasn't broken. Your foot was just so dislocated back; it had been essentially torn off your foot without bone
exactly.
breaking.
And just only thing that was still connecting it was my Achilles.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
Yeah.
Just completely bizarre, really wild. I think kind of fortunate in a weird way.
It was very fortunate.
That's like that articular surface and everything.
Exactly, because although it was a very painful and long recovery, in which I learned a lot about, as I'm sure you guys did in that recovery process, and about yourself and your willpower, right? Um, it was bad, and so at first they're like, yeah, if it doesn't heal up and it gets any sort of infection, like basically it's like I think they gave me 70% chance that they'd end up having to amputate it, so 30% chance that it might like heal okay. Then it was like some crazy odds that it'll if backing up a little bit. So then what happens, long story short, is about a month into it, it does get infected, and it gets like, to me, it looked gangrene. And they were like, no, they treat it with crazy antibiotics. I had to go back into the hospital for like 24 hours. And then the orthopedist, as I go through the cycle, they're telling me that I'll never walk without a cane, and that very likely I'll have what's called drop foot syndrome. So like the stabilizers in the front of your foot here, like using my hand as an example, they can't hold your foot up. So every time you step, your foot just wants to sag, and you got to like throw it up in front of you. And you normally need a cane if that's the case. And so it was a lot to deal with psychologically. And I was young, I just had my first kid. I'm like, fuck, I blew it big time, right? And but in that year of recovery and all of that inner soul searching, as I put it, the one thing I kept coming back to is, does this lifestyle and this pursuit mean enough to me to where I will do this again? As like traumatic as all of that was. And every time I'm like, without a doubt, I can't wait to prove all those doctors and my orthopedic surgeon incorrect, right? That like I'm not going to need a cane. And after about a year, it had recovered to where it was like probably 80% recovery and good enough to climb on, right? And I'm like, dude, I'll live with that. Like I can find a way around it if I get that 80% back. And then in the long run, it's probably, it goes back and forth between like 86 to 88, right? Um, but yeah, I think the moral of that whole story, at least for me personally, is that it did allow me to really come to terms with my mortality at such a young age. But then also B, that hey, this does mean that much to me, that I am a lifer at this. And what does it look like from here? Which is what segues into the rest of this story, right? So do you guys want to ask any questions based off of that little rant?
Yeah, I got a comment for sure. Just like for my injury, obviously, not quite apples to apples. I didn't have as much excitement as you. But like I slid down a granite slab and I went into like a piece of granite, and I just completely remember exactly what you were saying about like time slowing
For
down.
sure.
And it's such like a cliche, and like you've heard it, people have said it, but yeah, it was really just this fascinating thing of like feeling like I'm living in slow motion, like thinking through these things, looking, analyzing what I'm going to do. So crisp, so clear. Yeah, it's really just this like bizarre phenomenon, like that almost sounds like it's like out of a movie and not real life. But so I just wanted to comment on that. I was wondering, like, do you think that if your friend didn't have the military Motorola, that you would have died of blood loss or like the extraction of getting off the
That's a
mountain?
really good question. Since this has happened, and especially from a guide point of view, and I apologize if I offend any of my cohorts in this industry, unless it is life or limb, you should always be able to self-evac and not put other people's lives in danger like that. And when I say life and limb, like just shy of bleeding out, like in my scenario, you should be able to get yourself off the mountain. And I've done it in some almost equally as messed up situations. But with that said, um, that is a really good question, Max. Like say if it were just me and my brother, um, it could have been a much different outcome. And I think like let's say my buddy didn't have the Motorola phone, but he reset my foot and got the bleeding to stop. They would have probably just literally dragged me down the mountain and the few miles back to the car, right? Which would have really sucked. But it's like that's what it would have had to come down to. And because they got the bleeding to stop and it was like just at the threshold, as if I would have lost any more blood, I would have gone unconscious and potentially into cardiac arrest and maybe not come back, right? So it was a lot of luck in a lot of ways, right down to like my initial reaction was like, I am dead. Like it's going to crush my torso, right? So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I think that was interesting what you said, because like I felt a lot of guilt like when we ended up getting like a helicopter rescue and we were really not like I would fall in the category where you're saying like you should have self-extracted yourself. And I felt like a lot of guilt around that. I personally actually through like further analysis and like I follow SAR vehemently and they get called out for like way less than what I
For
went
sure,
through.
yeah.
And the doctor even told me that like had I had bumped my calcaneus, like my ankle would have been in like much worse shape, and my outcome of healing would be much worse. So I just wonder, like, is your thought process more so like self extraction should always be the goal because you don't want to risk the lives of the search and rescue people, and that it's almost like your responsibility
In
as
some
an
ways,
outdoor
in some ways,
enthusiast.
and I obviously have felt that guilt in every injury I've experienced, but not even like a lot of the other ones I didn't need a rescue. And believe me, there are times where I'm like, hit that distress button. And we were able to get through it. But I feel more guilty just the effect that I know it has on my immediate circle and all my loved ones. Right. And I think that's a very rational thing that we should all come to terms with. That just like with rockfall, and you do this long enough, and I've lost a lot of friends doing this, it can become an odds game, no matter how good you are at calculating the risk in certain venues. That's not across the board, obviously. The extraction thing, I think, is more, from me personally standpoint, it's definitely probably more of a little bit of a pride and ego thing. But there are a lot of accidents, like you mentioned, where it's like, yeah, helicopter rescue for grandma's blister, and then the helicopter crashes, right? And as guides, we are trained where that is a very last resort to ever hit that distress button. Yeah.
And I think that it's important to keep that mentality on the side of the person being rescued. It's like, all right, analyze your situation. How much of a dire strait are you really in? Are you going to potentially risk death or like severely injuring yourself further if you try to self extricate? Because in the end, the SAR people are doing their job. Like
No, and they
they
do enjoy doing
understand the
it.
risk and they
Yeah.
enjoy doing it. They assume the risk that they undertake, and we can't feel guilty, when we do use it. I think it's just circumstantial. We can't abuse it.
We 100%, Kyle. I love how the way that you touched on that. I think to elaborate a little bit more would be, um like, climbing is obviously a very selfish pursuit, and obviously every situation is different, and everybody's experience level and thresholds of pain, like, there's so many factors and moving parts, are different. Um and that's one of the things that, based off of that story I just told, I the first thing I did before I even wanted to become a guide was get my wilderness first responder, because I'm like, wow, okay, I'm starting to see more shit with myself and friends going to more backcountry settings. I want to be able to supply a little bit of help like my buddy did for me. That was the medic in the Air Force, right? And then it gets to the point with guiding to where, or I think even from a recreational standpoint, if you are getting into big enough mountains, let's say you're at a far off region and helicopter rescue isn't an option, like, you should know your shit enough to get out of any situation, just shy of, like, you're bleeding out and you're all alone, right? Then it's like, that's a whole different conversation. But if your buddy's there and he's of sound mind, he should be able to get you out of it.
I think that's super important. I think that for beginner climbers, it's really easy to focus on the art of climbing, the sport of climbing, the movement, and placing gear. And you can get really far with that. And I was one of those people. You can climb big objectives. You can get yourself really far away, and you can come back without a scratch.
For
But
sure.
I think it's really easy to underestimate just how exposed you really are
Yeah.
in these big alpine settings if something goes wrong. Because yeah, I mean, if I'll just use Temple Crag and Darkstar as an
Yeah.
example.
That is a great example.
When you're right up there on that ridge line, if you fuck up, I mean, you're fucked up
Yeah.
there.
You
And
might as well
I was
be
up
you might as well be in Patagonia or something, right?
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really easy to overlook that kind of
For sure.
exposure, and focus more on ability.
Maybe say, like, that's a little early on complacence. But it's
Yeah, for
more out
sure.
of just kind of pure ignorance, but not in a
Stoke
bad way,
and
that you're like,
ignorance.
wow, like, this won't happen, right? And I've been getting better at better, and I understand how to mitigate all the risk, but it can happen to anyone for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely resonate with you. Like, personally, I have my wilderness first responder and an emergency medical responder certificate. And so I did that in pursuit of just like, hey, being in the outdoors. I was like run guiding at the time and stuff. And so I think that those kind of courses are so valuable to so many people. And even just beyond, like, you don't have to be the most hardcore individual in the world to like benefit from that kind of a course. It's like, somebody has some kind of a medical emergency around you, or just understanding the processes of like the body and what's going on, or how to deal with something in that situation, how to operate
For
under
sure.
pressure. And then obviously that gets amplified, especially if, yeah, if you are spending multiple days out in the backcountry, or you are climbing, or you are doing dangerous sports. Yeah, it's pretty important to have skills, to be able to do those things and not get complacent with the skills, because you can get a course like that or trained like that, and it's like CPR is a great example.
You got to stay current.
You don't get a CPR certificate.
Yeah.
Exactly. You got to get recertified all the time for CPR, like every single year. And there's a reason for that, right? Like, under incredibly high pressure situations, if you don't
For sure.
practice the thing, it's not
You lose the edge,
intuitive
just
thing
like
that's
with
gonna
climbing.
happen and
Yeah,
come to
yeah.
you.
Yeah, so with that said, I've stayed current with my woofer since 2008. Um, yeah, and yeah, I just restarted in February, it's always fun. And at this point, it is so second nature for me. And unfortunately, I have had to use it in wilderness situations, um, as many times as when you take those courses and they tell you like someday you're going to use this. It's happened to me a lot of those some days now. Yeah, and it's not always with me and my team, but there's more and more people getting into the mountains, and I see stuff more and more regularly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing for your accident was that it's, for Max and I's like, Max, you were a little bit run out. You didn't place that piece that you thought you wanted to. Me, I'm climbing above my head in a new area on micro gear. The reasons for our errors were pretty much right in front of our face. Very easy for us to analyze. In your situation, it almost just seemed like the universe just pushed that rock on you.
It I
And
mean, I can't almost just explain it any other way.
I know,
And it's so
and that's
free
the hard thing to
just
swallow.
and just kind of scrambling too, right? And
Mhm.
with that said, I more than anybody have such a heightened appreciation for loose rock now. And I feel like I am
Mhm.
very very at one with it. And I can read loose rock terrain amazing, which obviously translates into doing FAs because there's a lot of loose rock.
I
Um,
think it also trains you for randomness.
it does,
Um,
definitely.
and I think that that's something that's really prevalent in the mountains. It's we spend every movement and every breath. It's all calculated, and we try to plan everything out move by move. But especially when you're FA or doing first ascents or you're out in the big mountains, randomness plays a huge factor, and
It does.
it's
No,
hard to mitigate for
it
that.
is. And I think,
Yeah, you can never mitigate all
yeah,
risk,
yeah.
right? So that's the thing is like you just want to make sure you've done your part to be as educated as possible, to be as competent as
You're
possible.
aware
So
of the risk
you can
that's
never eliminate all
involved.
that
Yeah,
risk.
yeah.
Totally. Will Gadd actually has a good article that he wrote on mitigating risk, and he specifically mentions that the universe does not love you. And I would think that your story is a really great example of that. The universe is not out to be nice to you and not out to love you. And there's a lot of beauty out there, but also like things
It
happen,
does.
right?
And
So
as
yeah.
as hard of a pill as it was for me to swallow at the time, I do look at it as this priceless learning experience that I got to endure and get to share it with others. So I'd like to go back to kind of what Kyle was saying a minute ago, as far as like kind of those lessons that the mountains can teach you. And obviously accidents suck. Um, you do still learn a lot from success, but this commonly comes up as a philosophical topic in guiding. And what's funny in guiding is like the unspoken rule is we're never allowed to talk politics and we're never allowed to talk religion. But philosophy comes up time and time again, which can get at least a little bit spiritual, right? So I'll tell one of the common things that you'll hear is it's like, yeah, you get too stuck on the summit and you have summit fever and you've lost track of like what you're even up there for and what the overall process is meant to serve, which is enjoying being in the moment and what you're learning about yourself as you're suffering as you're going along. And you're just that's all in the blinders and you're just like, nope, I'm going to the top, right? And to me, it's to the point now where it's like the top is a very subtle bonus. And I love what you learn about yourself in the process. And you learn something different every time, right? No matter how long you've been doing this. Um, it is also, I think, translates to where it's like early on, I would train really hard and I'd have these really high expectations on myself or my team or elements that were out of my control, like the weather, and just being like somewhat of an anal retentive bastard about it and take a lot of the fun out of it. And then go and something that is out of your control would happen. And then you're like, go running out of the mountains with your tail between your legs, kind of demoralized and not even like totally lost track as to like, hey, I learned more from that than if everything would have just gone perfect, right? And so it taught me, and it does translate into a lot of other life, that I go into all big climbs, especially now, with little to no expectations. And then every pitch you make it is a bonus. And it can make it a lot more magic. And then you're never let down in that regard either, right? And I do approach a lot of life like that for sure. Yeah.
I think what you're describing is the ease to slip into attaching ego and happiness to performance.
100%. Yeah.
Um, And I think that that can manifest it into peak bagging. It can be jade or grade chasing.
Yep.
It manifests itself into everybody's life a little bit differently. But I think with people coming from gyms and people entering the scene, the performance oriented mindset is much more trained into the people that are entering the scene these days. And it can be pretty dangerous because it blinds you from risk sometimes. And it also, like you said, in your situation, can take the fun out of it as well
Yeah,
if you're not reaching these whatever goals you're attaching your ego to.
exactly.
I, I also think depending on the goal, like, at least speaking for myself and my understanding is like, the actual process of getting to those bigger goals and getting to those peaks is like 90% or more, 99%. That moment you have at the peak is a really small amount. So if that's all you're out there for and what you're myopically focusing on, well, like you're just losing yourself in the process. Like you've got to learn how to enjoy the process. And bailing on a route might be a part of the process, saying, hey, the weather's not in our favor, like this isn't safe, we need to turn around. And then you do get those days where you get to, go and finish your objective or whatever for whatever that may be for you as an individual. But really, you need to learn how to enjoy the process, just like in life, if you don't enjoy like certain mundane things that you have to do for yourself,
Oh, you're going to be miserable, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
You're going to be so miserable, right? And so, yeah, so it's like you've
Yeah.
got to enjoy the process and don't just focus on the peak of the mountain,
Exactly.
whatever that is, whether it's like a metaphor for something in your life.
Yep.
Literal.
And like what I'll always go back to is it's like, and this is maybe getting a little metaphysical, and I don't like to talk destiny or fate or anything like that. But the biggest, most important climbs that I have ever gotten to experience, I very strongly feel happened when and why they're supposed to, and not only that, with whom they happened with. When other times I'd try to force that same thing and it wouldn't, and then when it would, it was even more magic, right? Like a great example of that was the first time that I ever climbed the nose, and I had trained so much for a year with my brother, and we had done a bunch of, all the prerequisite big walls that are supposed to set you up for that, right down to where I slept with the topo under my pillow for a year. Like to this day, I still have that topo super memorized, but I've also done the route a few times, which helps. And the first time we did it, um, 2 days into it, we got caught in a 5-day storm, used up all of our rations. It was amazing, although we were both pretty let down when we were like, wow, we have to go down at the end of this 5-day storm. But it just made us kind of want it more. And I was a little PTSD from that for a while afterwards. And we committed to where it's like, okay, we're going to train even harder. And in a year, we're going to go back and we will bring extra supplies, and going down isn't an option. And that was a unique approach at that moment, but we did it, and then it helped teach me that it's like, don't stress that stuff so much, and it will happen when it's supposed to. And then from that point on, as soon as I let go, all of the magic in my climbing career is when that really started to take off.
So you brought up the word PTSD, and it brings me to the topic of fear. I'm interested to hear your perspective on. So let me preface this for a little bit. So we deal with fear as climbers, and it's managing between listening to our intuition and knowing whether we're like in over our heads versus towing the line between I need to push through this feeling and I need to break through this bubble that I'm in. I need to push the limits. I need to be uncomfortable. There is a line to be danced, and um, my question, I guess, is how have you towed that line in your career? And what advice can you pass on to somebody trying to push themselves and to push the grades and explore themselves as a climber, but how to do it safely and toe
No,
that
that
line?
is a beautiful question, Kyle. And I knew you guys would have some good ones as this went on. Fear is a big part of climbing, I think, in general. I don't know any of us would maybe argue that. It's very common that you'll hear that it's like, hey, that part of your brain is like any other muscle. You can train it. And I do believe in that. I will be the first to admit that from the time I started doing this, heights and like let's back it up a little bit more. There's two psychological thoughts about your fear of heights. One is what they would label an umbilical fear of heights, which is your fear of standing on the side of a tall building or the side of a cliff. And the other is a fear of flying. As irrational as it is, most people have almost no fear of flying. And I think it's because it's like driving a car. It's just so second nature for us now. But most people have a very, very real, strong, biologically ingrained umbilical fear of heights still. And so climbing, I think that puts that very front and center. And from early on, like, you recognize that, but it's one of the beauties in it that, like, I think most of us could relate to, that right away you're like, oh, I'm getting better at turning and channeling this fear into upward progression and positive energy to get me through those moments where you're walking that line, right? Um, and that this obviously is, like, I think earlier on, and when a lot of people are getting into this, you do train that muscle, and the fear goes from, let me back it up a little bit too. So that umbilical fear of heights isn't so much your irrational fear of just standing, what it actually, like, on the side of some exposure, let's say, like, whether that's the side of a building or not, it's actually your fear of falling, right? So as you get better at climbing and identifying that part of that fear, and a big part of it is you finally confront that fear of falling more than like, hey, I'm afraid of being up here, right? And you're like, wow, the systems work. My belayer has me. And like any high risk, high impact sport, whether it's skateboarding, downhill mountain biking, motocross, like, you get good at falling. Skating's like one of the best ones. And most avid skaters that have done it for a long time naturally are some of the best I've ever seen at falling right out of the gates. Um, so when you get beyond that, then you're like, okay, I can focus on mastering these other fears that come along with everything that you just asked, right? And then what that translates to or transcends to is another philosophical point that, for me, a big part of the fear involved with this in every aspect, and it could be the unknowns of Mother Nature, right? Is I love trying to be a master of my own fears. And that is different for everybody. But I think inherently, all of us get that out of climbing, whether we're aware of it or not, that we are mastering our own fears. And then what does that do for us? It crosses over as far as at least a confidence level in a lot of other walks of life. You're like, fuck, like, this is nothing compared to those fears I was confronting yesterday up on that climb, right? Um, and so that aspect of the fear tolerance, I guess you could say, um, has made me a much better human. It's given me more confidence than I would have ever dreamed of. I mean, Kyle knows me a little bit, and I think most people who know me have this maybe idea of this person that has a lot of confidence in their mind, right? When in fact, like, when I was a kid growing up, I was one of the most insecure people I've ever known in my entire life. I got picked on and bullied a tremendous amount, more than I care to admit. Um, and it was another beautiful thing that when I discovered climbing, it was one of the I never liked team sports a whole lot, even though I did it. I surfed a lot, and that was more because of this unique connection I made with nature. But when I started climbing, it was one of the first times where I'm like, wow, there's nobody here to judge me or pick on me or call me names. And it's kind of just like me and my buddy against ourselves and against Mother Nature. And we could be as innocent, embrace our inner children, be as goofy as fuck as we want, because society is not here to judge us. The only thing that you could maybe argue that it will judge us in this moment is Mother Nature and our interpretation of the risk and fear that we are putting ourselves in those situations, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I want to expand on it a little
Yeah,
bit though.
for sure.
So you're describing like a person getting into climbing. There's definitely, we tend to be more cautious when we're getting into a risky sport. At least I hope most people are. But I
Yep.
think that this process you described of getting through the fear and turning it into confidence, you get to a place of confidence, possibly cockiness and complacency.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
how do you what kind of advice can you give to people to try to tackle those feelings? Let's say you're in that 5 year 6 year range, you haven't had any major accidents, you haven't seen any people get hurt, you've taken falls, but the system's worked, and so you've got no reason but to trust it entirely, and now you're towing that line and leading more towards more risk and complacency. So
Yeah.
besides getting yourself into an accident or having to see a friend die, how would you give people advice to back it off and learn some humbleness and some realistic risk management at that point?
So being humble would be a huge part of it, and I will get a little bit more into it, but you have to leave the fucking ego at the door, 100%. And when I first started climbing, it was amazing compared to my surfing background, which has a huge amount of ego. That I'm like, wow, there's some ego in this, but most people do leave it at the door. And I always interpret it as, I don't want to see this person die next to me because I'm being an asshole. But more as far as like back to like what you're asking, Kyle, is like ego does play a big part into that internal dialogue that you're having with yourself, as far as getting more confident, potentially getting complacent, getting cocky, as you put it. Um, One thing that helped me out a lot, and this isn't for everybody, but it was kind of more of the old school, the old guard train of thought that I came from when I got into this, was like when I started leading. Well, first of all, I wasn't allowed to lead until I climbed for like over a year on TR and bouldering. And then when I was able, it was like you can only use passive. You're not allowed to use cams for at least a year. And you better be building as many anchors to TR and rappel off of as you can, on top of leading all these climbs with passive gear. So twofold. With that approach, it way slows you down and keeps you in check, that you're not going to lead anything at your ability level, because you have to learn how to fiddle in these little chalks, right? Like that takes some practice, and you're not going to be doing it cruxing on something that's at your limit. So it really forces you to take a step back from where maybe your cockiness and your ego and the experience you've built up to that point would potentially take you. And then after doing that for a year, and it's like, oh, you're showing mastery of like nuts and hexes. Then it's like, here's a few cams, and you better save them for your anchors. And cams were a godsend after that, and you are very limited if you climb only off of passive, and you have to implement certain little tricks, like such as having a passive anchor that can take an upward pull, right? So that's one bit of advice. Like I said, that's not for everybody. And I do still preach that to a lot of guests that I do formally train. And I do a big mentorship thing that I've done for a long time. Almost nobody does it, but at least putting that in their mind, it forces them to take a step back and slow things down a little.
Yeah.
Furthermore,
it's kind of funny. I'm sorry, you go.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just gonna say it's kind of funny. I think not that like I'm incredibly experienced as a climber or anything, but like a lot of people I know who I would say are a little bit more older school or really experienced as climbers, they are incredibly talented with passive protection, and they really like placing like nuts and stuff like that. And I think the much newer generation is really heavy on active protection. And I don't really have like a stake in the game of saying like, one way or
one
the
over
other,
the other.
but
Yeah.
I do think that that's a really good point that you had, though, is like, as someone who has an arsenal of tools, you should have high competency with all of your tools and not just favor the ones that are easier for you, right?
It's like, how many people have stoppers hanging off of them and they're never using them? Versus Kyle, I know, loves his passive placements. Yeah.
I've actually wanted to do an Instagram series called Nothing But Nuts, and I wanted to climb.
That would be
climb a route with nothing but passive gear. My buddy Josh and I, when we were climbing, would actually have competitions. We would count how many passive pro we'd place in a pitch and add them up at the end of the multi pitch and see who had the most passive gear.
I mean, it can go a really long ways, and you can push it hard. It makes you a little maybe stronger minded in that regard. But cams are good. And back to what you were saying, as far as like doing a route that would be cool to do on all passive, that is actually a very common thing on the Nutcracker in Yosemite.
Okay.
Which that was the very first climb that was ever climbed with all passive, from everybody moving from active hammering to clean climbing. Wow. And so it is still kind of common on that route to be like, hey, like Roller Robbins did it with his wife with all stoppers to kind of help back up Yvonne Chenard and be like, hey, no, these work. Mm-hmm. You guys don't need to hammer pitons up here anymore. Meanwhile, my wife just did it with all stoppers and hexes. That one's awesome to do in that style still. And then there are a decent amount of Yosemite climbers that will still do that.
Yeah, I definitely think it's route dependent.
It is for sure,
Yeah,
right?
you
Yeah.
can't
So, and it's
climb
why
a
Cam
super
was
crack with a bunch of nuts.
Like flaring wide crack that's like uniform.
that is why Ray Jardine and Charlie Porter developed the spring-loaded camming device, because they became obsessed with a parallel-sided crack. And the story there is, it was this, they call it the 24-hour bet. And yeah, we could talk about that another time, but yeah, the history is always cool. I think back to your question though, Kyle, without going too off topic, there is some other things that I think are very important. And I think it's a big part of what you guys are doing, and having the guests on that you've had is the best thing, I think, without a doubt, especially like, we noticed this a while ago, that for the first time ever, climbers were coming out of gyms and their strength far exceeded their experience level. That had never happened before. And I started to see some really bad accidents in places by guys that I'm like, you're so strong, that shouldn't have happened. But they were just oblivious to like what good placements even look like, right? Or they're coming out of a gym climbing 5'10", maybe they've done a handful of like 5'11" out of the gym, maybe they've done a handful of 5'10" sport routes, and then their buddy throws them on a 5'7" trad climb at Joshua Tree after going like, oh, this is how you do this and this is how you do that. And that's a dangerous combination as well, as far as them being stronger than their experience level, right? And especially in their head, like that is a complacency and a cockiness thing as well. But with that said, what I'm getting at is, I think the most important advice I could give, which I did not have this, and in some ways I got lucky, in some ways, obviously, the story I just told may not have played out if I did have a legitimate mentor. And it was probably a solid 10 to 12 years into this game that I finally started to meet some guys that saw enough in me, that did take me under their wing, and they were OG legends that I looked up to for years. And you could say they taught me the ways. More than anything, it was good affirmation that I was like, oh no, you are doing everything right, and you're not sketchy about this at all. And part of it was because my strength level, my experience level evolved faster than my strength. But then they've always kind of been parallel, and maybe strength going up a little bit at a time, and then experience level kind of catching back up with it, right? But the mentorship process, I think, is probably one of the most overlooked things in our climbing society in the States. And it is starting, I think, to be recognized more, but still nobody, I think, has a very streamlined methodology as to like what that should actually look like, other than like how it unfolded for me. I wish that could happen for everybody. And it does become a safety thing, and it does come down to how you're mitigating risk, how your fear response to dealing with all of that is. Like I almost can't emphasize that enough. So the way I think it works for a lot of folks now, as much of a necessary evil as this has come down to, is hire a guide at the very least for one time. And more times than not, you will be surprised that that guide will see enough in you that it's like, hey, I know you're this starving college kid that can't afford coming out with me as many times as you need. So why don't you just start trying to come out with me like every so often? And like what I do, for example, I do offer that to a very large extent, but I'm like, I'm an open resource to everyone and anyone. And I give my card out to everyone I've ever shared a rope with. And I'm like, no matter how mundane it may be, how technical the systems may be, I love it when you guys ask me questions, send me pictures of your systems. I'm commonly like, there's no such thing as a dumb question when it comes to safety, kind of only dumb answers. And I love helping out to that extent and being able to extend that to people.
I think that's really, really awesome. And I've personally experienced that with like guides I've hired where they've like offered, an extension of being like, if you're ever back climbing in the area, like you want advice on a weather or a route or anything, like, it's kind of like building relationships. It's networking essentially.
It is
right?
networking, and if they're doing it for the right reason, that should be a given that just comes naturally, that you shouldn't even have to think about or be trained on, which that is part of the gig, and we do get some education on that, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah.
But we've talked about this essentially with like injury recovery of like, who is your support group? And I think you could kind of extend that into your climbing support group, you know, like
Definitely.
who
Yeah.
who are like, what are the resources, you know, to like reach out to
Yeah.
or to communicate with, or like who are people that you look up to or that you know speak with or whatever. It's just kind of building a community that you're actually injecting yourself
And
into.
it does become a family, or you'll hear it referred to as a tribe. And that is something that I'm very grateful for. Back to like me giving all that credit to my brother, is through the years, I have developed this amazing support group that I am like, I can't even put into words like how much their support and their belief in me has helped me get a share of this to capacities I would have never dreamed. Right. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it, if it wasn't for them, I know, I don't know if I would be sitting here having this conversation. Right.
So do you and your brother still climb today? Like
Oh
to
yeah.
this day?
Yeah,
Awesome.
definitely. Yeah. Hey, Jonathan.
Shout out to Jonathan.
Yeah. His IG handle is Adventure Weasel. He's
Adventure
the smart one of
Weasel.
the family. Yeah.
I'm gonna write that down.
So he has a real job. He's a terrestrial biologist, and he's one of the chief biologists for the West Coast.
Wow.
So really, all he does is drive around and look for endangered species and monitor them. And if they're in any sort of threatening situation, mainly because of urban sprawl, my brother shuts it all down.
Is that why he hangs out with you so much? He's looking out for endangered species.
Oh yeah, no, we do a lot. I mean, he's taught me more than I even knew there was to know about biology. It's pretty cool. It's like it's like basically having a biological professor in my pocket that I can talk to whenever I want.
Yeah.
And then that
awesome,
crosses
man.
over into getting to share this a lot. And guiding, we're supposed to know a lot about the history and the local biology. So I love getting to share that based off of all the interesting knowledge my brother has shared with me. Yeah.
I think that this topic of mentorship is a really, really good one. And I'll attest to you, being a mentor for myself. And in the beginning stages, I met you at Nomad Ventures. You were sitting behind the desk. You saw the twilight in my eyes. I was walking in there just looking at all the gear and stuff. And, you told me about Takits and everything. And, I was looking in there. You were my rock, like I was looking to get into multi-pitch trad, and I was leading for the first time and bringing somebody else up, like I didn't really have a mentor. I couldn't find anybody that was climbing harder than me or wanted to do objectives more, challenging than me. And so,
no,
I
apologize. I couldn't be there more.
No, dude, man, it was awesome. Like you honestly, for where I was and for what I wanted to do, you were exactly what I needed. Exactly.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting how that'll happen.
Yeah.
Like time and time again. Yeah.
And ever since that day, we did the little climb up Black Death. Like you've been super open and just like attesting to your willingness to help people who reach out to you and stuff. So I'm sure I'm not the only one. Like just back to mentorship itself. I think that, Max, you said you had a pretty good mentor going into your climbing career. I personally didn't. And I think that there's a lot of other people that could say the same. I think it's hard to find people that are climbing harder than you or have more experience than you are and willing to take you under their wing, because a lot of those people either have mentors that they're climbing with and they're learning from, or, they don't want to have to slow down. There's a lot of other complications and stuff. It takes a pretty special person to want to do that for another person. And I think it's pretty hard to come by. It's just like,
I would agree, and thank you for the compliments too.
Yeah, man.
Yeah,
I think with mentorship, it's kind of like a cultural thing, obviously that's embedded in climbing. But I think also, like, if I analyze it from a more like modern perspective, like it's a two-way street. Like we need to breed a culture of mentors who want to seek out and go and mentor people, which I think there is. But obviously, the amount of climbing compared to the amount of really experienced, confident climbers,
it's very
huge
skewed.
ratio disparity. Yeah. So we also need to have a kind of and I hope we're contributing to this, is like breeding a culture of, if you are a new climber and you are invested and you're interested and you have these goals, whatever they are for yourself, the idea that like the perfect person with the perfect temperament who has the time and all these things is just gonna like fall into your lap. It's like, the chances aren't that high. So also we need to have a culture of like new people, seeking out mentors, seeking out these relationships, trying to inject themselves in these situations. It is a two-way street. and you as an individual have some agency and personal responsibility to do this. And then the caveat to that is that, if you aren't finding that person, well, we've got the AMGA, we've got the ACMG, we have these really well accredited industry professionals who, you can hire to get that result. And then usually those people are really well connected in the community. And, like you were saying, offering, advice or exterior resources, or they can even just point you in the right direction. Like, hey, I was out with this client 3 weeks ago. He's a totally rad dude in the area. He's climbing up the storm and he's looking for friends to climb with.
Exactly.
It's just about like, it's about trying to seek out and engage in those kind of
Yeah.
opportunities.
No,
for
and I
yourself.
think
that
climbing
like
can,
as climbers we have a responsibility.
it can be very intimidating too for a lot of new folks and coming out of gyms and feeling a lot of these insecurities we're talking about, to go up to even like someone like either of you. Like, you guys both are studs and you look intimidating. I know you're very approachable, but it's like, if I see you at the crag, I'm gonna be like, oh man, I want to be like that guy. And like, how do I even strike up a conversation with him, right? And that's where I think it's important for us to do our due diligence to make, we hear it a lot lately as far as making this more inclusive, but just make those folks feel more comfortable and more genuinely like just psyched about, no, you're out doing this for the right reason, right? And
Totally.
and this is why I do it too, yeah. So I think that goes
I
a
think
really
that
long
it's
ways.
I think we're using the word mentor as kind of like this long-term partner that's taking you up multi-objectives and shaping you as a climber.
Yep.
But I think that mentorship can also mean something else. It could be a comment at a crag that someone who's more
100%.
experienced says to somebody else.
Yeah,
It could be,
you should be able to find a
it could,
mentor in kind of every situation. If you're
well,
looking at it as far as like, hey, what can I learn from this experience, right?
I think I'm more speaking of us all trying to be mentors for the people around us.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, let's say you've climbed 5'9", that's your climbing level and you've been climbing for a year. You're a mentor to someone just getting in. And this goes on and on and on for anybody who has experience. You're always going to be a mentor for someone below you.
Yeah.
And like for me at my place, like I can take somebody out right now and like go cragging and do a trad day and still have fun and push my grades because I can have someone belay me. But I can also take the time to just go over basic trad stuff with someone. I can show them how to place something. I can spend 15 minutes with somebody and change their entire course.
Yeah. No, and
of their trad career. And it's like, it doesn't take that much effort to have that mentality.
I would say that's a huge part of the process, and recognizing that is a big part of the process versus like, hey, chasing numbers or just getting out there to be rad, right?
Yeah, totally.
And yeah, I mean, for me, like one of my original mentors, I was like, kind of like, yeah, like, do you ever get bored of this? And he's like, never. And I totally get that now. It's like there are some of the mellowest moderate routes that are amazing 4 or 5 star classics that we have in the nation. And I've done them hundreds of times now. And it is different every time. And every time it's just as exciting. And that's kind of the common thing, I guess, when you get to that point that you'll hear even from someone at the crag. It's like, oh, what's your favorite climb? And my answer is always, it's the last one I did, right? It's like, yeah, that one you just saw me on, that was my favorite as of at least in this moment. But yeah, the mentorship thing is interesting. And I'm glad that we're talking about that because I do see it coming up more and more. And like I said, I think it is hard for people to maybe put into a box. And Kyle, as you mentioned, it's like, oh, like even for me, I was like, yeah, it's this gnarl old hard dude that's been doing this forever. And he's going to get me up to par with him. And it's come close to happening in that way, but more times than not, it's like even my guests that I'm teaching, they become my mentors a lot of the times, right? And what's in the sense that maybe it's one time I spent with them and I learned something from them or a new application on a climb, like I said, that I've done hundreds of times, to kind of blow their mind even further. But then a lot of times it turns into more of a mentorship process. They surpass where I will ever get to. And then I see them, that trickle effect, and them sharing that with everybody else, right? So I think
That's
maybe
really
for
cool.
now, that is important that people are at least recognize that it's like, hey, we have that. If you can't like go out and get a share rope with Peter Croft tomorrow, right? Yeah. What else? Where do we want to go next?
I think one thing I could say on like fear and mitigating risk and stuff was like, you know, it as much as like getting motivated and stoked and wanting to climb really hard and all these things is amazing, and I don't deter from that at all. Also, like realize that like it's not the movies, and you're probably not Alex Honnold, and you're climbing for yourself, you know. And so if you feel more comfortable carrying like a little bit of a fatter rack and like running moderates, and you don't want to run it out, like, you know, don't pressure yourself into like trying to be something that there's like this ethos in climbing about like being hard and being tough and running it out. And I think that for people who do those things and live that kind of ethos, I think it's really impressive and really admirable. But like speaking for myself, like around the time of my injury, I was getting into like lightening my rack and trying to move really fast in like efficiently in the mountains. And it like, as much as I was doing it okay, like, for one, A, it obviously didn't work out that great. And B, it like, as I was doing it, it didn't really feel like me. Like I was trying to adapt how I wanted to climb to how I thought I should climb if I wanted to be a good climber. And so I guess for me, it's just like, if you are the type of person who you want to, you know, get better and stuff, but like maybe you're really uncomfortable and really pushing your comfort zone and stuff in ways that you're not sure about, take a step back, you know, like that's okay. Take a step back, you know, don't.
This exact thing you're talking about, I was at the crag the other day, and there's this new guy who's getting into trad. He's on his second trad lead, all right? Second trad lead, 5'8", and he's at the base looking at me, and he's like telling me, he's like, dude, all right, so I looked at it, like, I'm trying to bring as little gear as possible. Like, he said that. Like, he's already in that mindset of trying to lean down, trying to be more efficient, trying to be a more badass climber. And then again, he's up at this crux section on this 5'8". He's getting a little stressed, you know, you could tell. And, you know, he gets past the crux and he gets a piece in. And this one mentor guy who was with us is like, hey, you know, it's okay to take. And he just like shakes his head like this. And he's like, no, I won't take, you know? And so it's just like, it's a pride thing, but I think it's so ingrained into the sport. It's like, face your fears, manage the risk, like, don't take as much gear, you know? It's like,
I mean, so much. You could give a lot of that blame to like climbing media as well, right? It's like, how often do you even see like badass shit on the cover of a magazine? Yeah. I'm sure you guys have seen it, heard this.
No one's wearing a helmet.
Anyone's ever even wearing a helmet, right? And it's like, I wear a helmet religiously. I didn't when I was younger, but it's like, as I started to have kids and experience some of these mishaps, I'm like, no, like that. Like there are things we can do that are very simple, like carrying a few more pieces, right? Not being afraid to take. Yeah.
Totally. Well, I think of that 5'8" guy at the crag you're talking about, you know, we could take Josh's example here. You know, how about you go up and you place 40 stoppers?
There you go.
You know
yeah.
The route will take you 4 times as long, so you get like,
and you'll get way more experience,
stimulus, way more experience, and it's safer.
Exactly.
So like you're almost just like cheating yourself out of like safety and experience.
Exactly.
And I think that's kind of what I was speaking to when I was making that comment, Kyle. I think that was a great example, right? It's just like, you know, I think generally by the time you're ready to really push things and really like thread the needle, like you'll know, because you're probably like a crusher and you're super motivated and you're like biting at the gills every weekend to get out, and you it's like you just will know, you know. So if you're like new to the sport or don't feel comfortable, or you're getting like the sewing pin leg on like a 5'9", like really worried up there, it's like, yeah, man, don't cut it out, you know, like put in like 3 extra cams. If you need to take, like whatever it is, to just like, ultimately the goal here, and, you know, our podcast is catered to the majority of people. It's like we want people to get out and to feel good and to experience the sport of climbing, and to hopefully not have a 1-ton boulder rip their foot off or break both their ankles.
No.
You know what I mean? It's like that's not.
I mean, it's the common saying is to climb smarter.
It happens
harder,
more than
right?
we want as climbers.
Yeah, but people just, what does that even mean? Like, no.
Yeah, well, you could also chase down the people that are climbing harder and pushing those boundaries. I bet you the more people you chase down like that are either dead or have been through a traumatic injury. Like, the numbers go up significantly when you start running the thread like that.
I mean, no, like you are cutting corners and heightening the risk factor for sure. And hopefully you are aware of
Mhm.
that. Yeah. So, and
Yeah,
I've
exactly.
definitely, I'm
Yeah.
guilty of walking that line. And for a long time, even having a family, and where it didn't really hit me until I actually had my third kid, which was a girl. And like, I was like, wow, like my
Oh,
boys, I guess subconsciously, like, could have gotten by without me, but not a girl. Like, for whatever reason, it messed with my psyche way more than almost anything. And I did pump the brakes tremendously with where I had previously gone with it. Yeah. But I found more of a balance, you could say. Yeah. And a lot of that is
yeah.
the love of getting to go do new route development. So let's talk about that and how that all came about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um yeah. So I guess after that accident when I was younger, and I had that conversation with myself loud and clear a bunch of times where it's like, no, I will do this the rest of my life. Like, it was around like, I remember, like, not too long after that, like, seeing other accidents, people getting in that were way more traumatic even, and them overcoming it and still being involved in the outdoors. And I was like, yeah, okay, it's a little more justified. That was a freak accident. I'm like, what could be worse than that other than death? So I'm like, as far as like one way that I've always tried to rationalize it is nothing that bad could ever happen to me in the mountains again, other than maybe dying. And I could live with anything else, right? So it was like game on. I'm like, yeah, I experienced the worst. And since I did, like, the law of averages, I like, and this is probably not a good way to rationalize this. Like, nothing like this should ever happen again, especially if I'm very cognizant of it, right? And I yeah, I avoided accidents for a long time after that. And I got way immersed in it. I got stronger than I ever had. More importantly, I gained way more experience than I ever had. I started to do bigger and bigger objectives, um, none of which ever felt forced. They all happened, like I mentioned earlier, kind of when they felt like they were supposed to. And it was like beyond words, like so many magical experiences that I hope a lot of climbers do get to experience. Um, and so as that kind of progressed, this is maybe fast forwarding 5 years now. So it's 2008. So 7 years. Um, and backing it up a little bit, through that next 7 to 8 year period, I from the get go, I have been like a very devoted trad climber, you could say. And to me, the pinnacle of all of it, we're doing like the biggest, like most inspiring routes in the world. Although I haven't done nearly all of the ones I've wanted to, I've gotten to play on some of them, let's say. And as I would put it, there were a lot of very serendipitous moments that little me would have never ever dreamed of in a million years. So kind of a living testament that I like to say, like, if I could do it, anybody could do it. Especially after such kind of traumatic experience when I was younger with this. And so I was still young. You know, this is all before I'm even 26. I didn't know what the fuck I wanted to do in life. I had mentioned, like, I was born into a career I thought I would do forever, which was working in the surfboard industry. And my uncle owns one of the largest surfboard manufacturers on the planet. So I started working there when I was 12. And as I mentioned, it's still a faucet of the outdoor industry. So all through this, that's what I'm doing. But then I went to college and I got my art degree. Um, I'm I start working at a gear shop. um, I love art, as I mentioned before, and I got really into tattooing. So I'm working at a tattoo parlor, and I have a family. I'm trying to balance all of that. Like, how do you even find time for climbing, right? But climbing through those early years, it won out, and I knew it always would. So what happened was in 2000 and I guess it was 2008. Getting stronger. I had this kind of like nemesis climb in the Sierras, which is just a casual classic route called Bear Creek Spire. I'd gone to do it 5 times, and because of circumstantial situations, like friends getting altitude sickness, weather, never even got off the ground. Like we did this 6-mile death march every time, and I'm just like, what is up with this thing? And then finally, was gonna go do it with my brother. We're gonna do it in a day, and I'm like, oh, it's on. Well, I'll do it with him, easy. And we're bouldering like the weekend before, and I'm on this boulder problem, probably 3 feet off the ground with like 5 giant pads and like 4 of my like big ass buddies spotting me. And I do this little slip. It was the end of the day. Like my foot popped, but I'm not that high off the ground. Land on the pads, kind of roll with it, fall into my back, and I feel a weird pop. And I'm like, oh, I think I broke my leg. And this is my other leg now. And you know, I'd had a couple other superficial injuries in the meantime. But my buddies are like, there's no way you broke it. Like, get up, walk it off, you know, like get up there and send that thing. And as I stand up, like mid shaft tib fib spiral fracture, it just collapses in half, and I shattered that in 20 places. Yeah, it's like just splintered like beyond belief. And back to what you had mentioned earlier, Max, as far as like my other injury I sustained, and it was more soft tissue. This was a way worse healing process. And obviously the Bear Creek Spire trip got canceled. This was just after my brother and I had tried to do the nose for the first time. So I'm supposed to be training for the next year. I'm like, fuck, I'm out of it for a year now. And so that recovery, I remember being pretty stubborn, and it was very painful. But, you know, unlike the first one, I'm like, oh, this is just part of the process, and it'll probably happen again. Okay. And you know, just for the both of you, like if you guys stick with this long enough, like expect to have some other mishaps, and hopefully it's nothing too serious. And that was kind of another random freak thing, but there were a few things that led up to it, such as like just being tired and, you know, letting my guard down. It's this little boulder problem I'm 3 feet off the ground on, and not giving it that respect. And so that was in June, and that January, my orthopedist is like, yeah, you can start walking again, and maybe like you got to start doing all this physical therapy, obviously. Long story short, didn't end up needing any surgery on it, although that was like up in the air through the whole process. I had a really good sports orthopedic at the time, and he's like, no, we're not even going to put you in a cast. We're going to let you be in an inflatable cast for 3 months, but I want you to try to use it and not get atrophy as much as you can. And if it doesn't start to fuse in 3 months, then we'll have to go in and put plates in. After 3 months, he's like, yeah, it's not fusing. It's not looking good. Let's give it another month. And another month, he's like, no, like you see in the x-ray, like all of these bones have sticky ends now. That mean that they're fusing together naturally. And that's what I want. Like surgery is a last resort, even though what you have, typically you'd go straight into surgery for it. And so 6 months into it is all fusing. Basically I have like a huge calcium knot there now. But it was New Year's Eve, and I'm like, I think I'd gone on this like one kind of random drunken boulder mission up at Black Mountain, popular bouldering area in Southern California. And it was more just to go be around my friends climbing and stuff. And I'm like drinking and dealing with my issues. And I'm like, well, okay, like I could climb, but I could still barely walk. Climbing didn't hurt too bad though. And obviously I don't want to fall onto it. Would have been really bad. So, you know, a few days goes by, it's New Year's Eve, and me and my brother at this party where like nobody there is really outdoor oriented. And it's him and I in this back corner, just talking, climbing, and like feeding off of each other's energy. And we're obviously drinking. It's about 10 o'clock. We're waiting for the New Year's countdown. And we start like kind of like going, okay, like your leg's getting better. This is the year we're gonna do the nose. Like what let's like make all these amazing like big climbing objectives that are kind of like New Year's resolution. And that kind of escalates, and basically on like a drunken bet, my brother, like one of the climbs we really want to do besides the nose and besides to finally get to go do Bear Creek Spire, which by the way we went and did both of those, was to go do epinephrine for the first time in Red Rocks. And like we'd always wanted to do that. And you know, in the moment, like basically my brother's like, you can climb, like I'll help you hike in and hike out, like let's drive out there right now on the first of the year. And we're drunk off of our asses at like 10 o'clock at night, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds amazing. our wives are like, no, you guys, like you need to at least sober up. And we're like, well, we'll go home and pack, and by that time we'll be sober to drive, which we still weren't. drove straight to Vegas, blasted up an effort with a broken leg, and then had to crawl the entire way off of it through cactus. And so and then that was also the year that I like made the conscious decision to become a guide. And that was kind of part of that whole process in that moment with my brother that night. And that was back to what we were talking about before we started earlier, Max. That was the year I turned 29. I had this huge year climbing. I remember when I was recovering from that break and just going like, man, I don't want to go back to the surf industry. Like it had become very diluted. It was taught to me as this like pure craft, like trade that is very much a lost art in most parts of the world now. And it had started to lose sight of that. And I was getting a little jaded from it. Although like I was comfortable and I thought I would do it forever. And I remember like, man, I really don't want to go back. And I was looking in the classifieds in a newspaper, and I saw this article, and it was like 30 grand to go work for 3 months on the Greenland ice sheet, babysitting some scientists. Like was almost how, like paraphrasing how this article was worded. And I'm like, fuck, I could do that for 30 grand. And it's like prerequisite. You have to be an AMGA Alpine guide. And I'm like, oh, well, AMGA. Okay. Like I know of this. Like I knew of a couple guides, and, but I still didn't know what that really meant, right? And so I'm like, okay, like let's look into it. Even this isn't maybe just even a bad pursuit for my own self growth was why I originally went into it. Like I still didn't really quite care to be a guide, but I saw maybe the potential of like getting some side gigs. And when I went down the track, I was like, all right, like 5 years of discipline, easy. And I 5 years into it was like not even halfway to where I thought I should be, and beat myself up over that a little bit. And getting a little frustrated, but plucking away at all the different courses and the different certs, right? And being able to guide more to what I had always wanted to guide. And at one point, I think like 6 or 7 years into it, and life obviously gets in the way, um, as it does with just climbing in general sometimes, right? And it's important to find that balance. I remember the acting president at the time of the AMGA writes me this really nice letter, and it wasn't any real concern I was expressing, but at that time it was a little tighter knit, and they obviously picked up on a lot of different people's energy and where they were at in regards to where they wanted to be at. And she tells me, she's like, so Josh, like, can you get your PhD to become a surgeon in 5 years? And I'm like, no. And she's like, better yet, like, what martial arts could you get your black belt in under 10? And I'm like, dude, it clicked right away. And I'm like, yeah, no, you're so right. And like, just embrace the process. And now, I'm basically 15 years into it, and I'm still only halfway to where I wanted to be that initial 5 years into it. Right.
It's funny that you say that, Josh, because like, I've been climbing for maybe like, I don't know, like 5-6 years, but like the first 3 years of that was like, nothing, randomly in the gym, just like occasionally. So like I've really actually been climbing for 3 years, and I've had serious injuries through that. Right. So, and I really actually want to become a guide. It's something that I've really thought about and that I really want to do. And I don't really like, and so part of me has this big, like deep seated doubt of being like, I'm not talented enough. I'm not a strong enough climber, but I feel like I really have the temperament for it. And I don't want to necessarily go guide out like hard routes all the time. I think my niche would be, I really enjoy doing like clinics and facilitating like easy outings for people. And so,
more the instructor and mentorship side.
And so the only reason I would not chase this is because I tell myself like I'm never going to be good enough to do that. And I think I really resonate with what you're saying right now, because I'm the same thing. I'm like, like let's just take your PhD reference or your black belt reference. It's like, okay, you're 3 years into serious climbing. Why the fuck would you have any of the necessary skills or anything to do that, right? So it's kind of just this outlandish claim that or like not claim, but like thought process of like where I should be. I personally 100% resonate with that. And so in the last like 6 months, I've really kind of had this internal dialogue with myself of going like, you know what? I have all these things in my life that I'm really happy with, and I'm really satisfied about this. And I'm not going to just let this like negative internal voice that just like is self-deprecating and tells myself like I'm not going to be able to achieve this because I didn't achieve it in like 3 years, which is outlandish anyways. It's like I'm gonna take my time. I'm gonna work hard at this. I'm gonna be consistent at it. And it's still my goal one day to get an ACMG, whether that's an apprentice rock guide certificate or apprentice ice, and to do that and to be able to facilitate outings and to mentor and guide people, like that is still a goal of mine. So just what you were saying, I just resonate with so much on such a high level, and it's a real big thing I struggle with of taking that negative voice out of my head and just saying, like, fuck that. I'm going to work hard at this, and it's going to take a lot longer than I think it's going to take, but I'm going to get there eventually.
For sure. So I was the same age as you when I made that conscious decision. And when I did, and I took, it was a leap of faith. And I've taken many leaps of faith. And because I put so much positive forward thinking into it, it's all worked out the way that I'd always dreamed. If I could do it, you can do it. So much of it is patience, and that anything in life that is truly important isn't going to be fucking easy, right? Like it will be a long, involved struggle, and that is part of the process. And I think the black belt analogy, especially, like, could go back to what we were talking about as far as mentorship and where you see yourself in comparison to a lot of other people you might see at the crag, and what your like misconception might be as to how you want this to look, or how you think it should look, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, so I did take that leap of faith, and the struggle was very real originally, even when I had come to terms with like, hey, this isn't happening as fast as I want. But I gave up a long time ago on any monetary gain. I'm like, this means so much to me. I would sacrifice everything. I'll be homeless. My wife hates me because she's like, she was right along with all of it. She's always been my biggest supporter. Yeah. And we were like I said, we were homeless for 3 solid years. It was very slow, but one of the best pieces of advice I could give there, that I was very lucky, is in your first like year, especially your first 3 years, no matter how lame it seems, to get as many numbers under your belt as possible. And then that will just help snowball and carry that momentum throughout however long you want to do it. And so originally, the first company I worked for, I guided 3,000 people for them in the first 4 years. And that's a whole nother story, but it was a huge, it did give me a lot of that momentum. And then also back to what you were saying, Max, as to where it's gotten now, and what I see makes successful guides is trying to find your own niche, which is hard. But people have been coming up with some pretty original stuff, and it's something early on. I'm like, hey, I kind of fall into this niche, which is like sharing it to this capacity, but as mentioned, and as we'll talk about a little bit more, like to a lot of other capacities and other like stages that I get to share this on, right? So I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah, no, super cool, man. Yeah, it's awesome.
So I think that this is a question I guess I have is you, and something you've been circling around, is your passion for setting up first ascents. To me, is the pursuit of an athlete, where the mentorship side is the pursuit of a teacher. It seems that you have these two paths. How have you managed both of them in your life? Because I feel like, you could definitely have leaned all into the athlete side and just gone after setting up first
For
ascents.
sure. No, I like this, and it's great because this kept slipping in and out of like me talking and wanting to touch on that a bit. So as I mentioned to you guys when we had our first little mock meeting, um, I have this artistic background, you can say. Like, I've never really considered myself an artist, but everybody else does. So I embrace it a lot more now than I did when I was younger. But for me, it was never an athletic pursuit at all. That was just a side byproduct of being so active in the mountains, as it does put you in good shape. And the trade-off is that is important when it comes down to being able to perform and like perform on and dance on a dime at a moment's notice, right? Whatever the case may be. To me, I was always good at certain aspects of creativity, you could say. But the one thing I always admired the most and always was the worst at was any sort of performing art. So always been way envious of musicians. I'm finally getting a little better at music, and I love music, but just yeah, that never clicked for me. Drama, dance, hell no. Okay. I was always a stagehand in drama class. So when I discovered climbing, and I appreciate and respect and recognize the athletic side of it. And just like we were talking about earlier, like idolized a lot of my climbing heroes growing up because of the pursuits that they were fulfilling in their own right. And I always identified with that as being like, wow, they're this like amazing fit, like triathlete, like even beyond that type of conditioning, right? And which wasn't always the case with a lot of those individuals. That was just how I perceived it. So when I started getting into it, the first thing I fell in love with was the fact that I viewed it not as an athletic pursuit, that it was a performing art. And you'll hear, it's a moving meditation. For me, it was this like beautiful vertical dance that I got to do with no one around judging me. And everybody does it a little differently. All of our body styles are different. Our experience levels are different. To me, that was a very beautiful thing. And just to try to like cut my teeth and become more well-rounded with this, I was pursuing, I think, all the common classics that everybody does. And I think, without veering too off track, one of my buddies who comes from more of a gaming generation, he has this beautiful analogy that it's like you can't start out climbing and you're at level 1 and expect to skip to level 10 and defeat the boss, no matter how many cheat codes you have. And you have to go through it systematically, right? And so I was doing that. And then, got my first mentor, and he has done thousands and thousands of FAs. And I'm like, why, dude? Like, there's so many classics. Like, did you really do them all? And you're like, this is what I have to do. And he's like, no, like I love all of those classic bread and butter trade routes still, but you'll get to the point to find that same excitement that you had the very first time you ever tied in. You have to go into the unknown. And he's like, Josh, it's the purest adventure. It's not for everybody, and you may never even get this. But in that moment, I'm like, no, that makes sense. I still don't get it though. I'm gonna go climb this classic multi-pitch 5.8 or whatever, right? And for the 20th time, and just make, and each time it should get better and better. I'm basically just repeating the same level and defeating the same boss a little more efficiently, right? And then it got to the point to where, and it comes back to the fear and risk mitigation a little bit. I'd always made a very deep promise to myself to never climb ropeless. But I remember standing at a crag that I had guided these routes thousands of times now, and I still loved it to death, but it was becoming a little mundane. And I remember in that moment going like, this is what my buddy told me, in parallel with like doing new routes, was it's like, yeah, okay, to do the same route that I promised myself 15 years ago I would never do ropeless, to get that same excitement, yeah, it makes sense just to leave the rope on the ground, right? And obviously I did do a decent amount of ropeless climbing on moderates, just more for training, than I care to admit. But then what happened was, in that process, I found that you could get the same experience, I guess you could say, but infinite, like tenfold at least, if not infinite amount of times, developing new routes. And then I fell in love with the beauty of that creative process even more than like the vertical ballet that I described a minute ago, because now it was this blank canvas that you had nothing to compare it to, and I got to paint whatever I wanted up that wall, and or as I like to put it, like bring that vision of that blank canvas to life, to get a hopefully someday share inadvertently with generations of climbers I'll never know, the same way I was inspired by doing said classic trade routes and being inspired by the history of what those guys were like, that what inspired them to want to be the first to do that. And it is magic. And I don't say it's for everybody. I've taken a lot of people up new routes and they're like, yeah, fuck that. Or a lot of times, like the common joke is, it's like, we'll death march for 6 hours to do a 30-foot chassis 5.6. That's not all the time, especially with when you know where to look. but that can be par for the course, and it is a lot of hard work. But it's extremely rewarding, and you never see anybody, and it is the purest adventure, from a personal standpoint, and getting to share that with others and see them go through all those emotions and jubilations as
Yeah,
well.
I think that
So,
your comparison to FAs and soloing is a very interesting one. And it's cool that you kind of relate the high or the rewards physically in terms of the adventure and the exposure kind of being similar. But I think something you've already noted, and I think that is something to point out, is that soloing is completely selfish to its core, and the FA is, it has selfishness to it, but in the end, you're giving more to everyone else than you ever could give to yourself. And I think that's so beautiful, that you kind of linked the two. And I think that it's almost like this like light versus dark side, you know? It's like
oh,
there's
for
like a
sure,
different side of
no,
the coin, and it's really cool that you've kind of had that perspective on it. And it is, you
yeah.
definitely are. It's cool that you're able to get that same experience out of something that offers
To
more at the
throw
same time.
some more, yeah, to throw some more numbers out there and stroke my ego a little bit more, which I like try not to do too much, obviously. Um, I've done well over 2,000 FAs now, and a lot of them have been like up to grade 5, like some big solid routes. But the most magic thing about all that is getting neat feedback from people that are doing routes that you're like, wow, that's kind of obscure. I didn't know that one would gain momentum. Um, but then even more so, what's happened is a lot of routes I've developed have become like very common trade routes for me and other guides to go guide now. And that was not really the intention when I was doing those, but now I do search that out a little bit more.
It's too bad you can't
It's
charge
like
at the
I'm always
base
like,
for them.
oh, yeah, yeah, right. Um, yeah.
Like a per bolt fee.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
No, that's cool though.
that would defeat a
Like
lot of the
designing a row with the
defeat a lot of the
intention of
purpose.
being like, I'm gonna guide this in the future.
And
It's like this is an
it's
amazing route
amazing.
for me to take people out and
Exactly. And
experience
and
that
it
on
teaches like everything that I would want to cover with them on
Yeah.
said day out as far as what they're trying to get out
Yeah.
of it, right? So that's been pretty magic for sure from like a developmental standpoint. Um so that has been my main pursuit, even like hard to balance that one with as far as like, do I do more guiding or do I do more FAs? Since probably like 2010. Um yeah, and I love it to death. Like right now I have a bunch going. Kyle, you probably remember for my 40th birthday, which I'm 41 now. So like turning 40, especially for a dude, is kind of like a weird thing. I didn't think it was going to be until it happened. And I've always thought birthday challenges for climbing were like a bit cliche. But I'd help some friends with them, It's like, oh, you're turning 33, let's go climb 33 pitches, whatever. Never done anything like that. So for my 40th birthday, a lot of friends were like, dude, you should do something like that, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, no, no. But then my son, my oldest son, who was still climbs with me a decent amount, but he was a core climbing partner of mine for a long time. Even like my son when he was like 13 did some of my biggest FAs with me
Wow.
ever. So when someday someone comes along and repeats some of those, it's interesting to think that like dad was taking his young kid up that. That could be interpreted a lot of different ways, but yeah, the birthday challenge. So my son is like, yeah, so you should do 40 first ascents in 40 days.
Oh.
And I'm like, well, where did that come from? We're bouldering when he comes up with this. And I'm like, my birthday was like a month and a half out. So I go home and I'm like, dude, this is the perfect opportunity to go do a lot of FAs I've been wanting to do. I'll force myself to take like solely focus on that. And then I came up with these rules where it's like, it had to be in 4 different areas. It couldn't all be in the same area. And at least a quarter of them had to be up to grade 4. And it was one of the most outlandish, like outer body things I ever did. But I did it. It was super rad. So just another example of like having fun with like developing new routes, Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll bring up another question on FAs. I'd like to talk about ethics. I think that, and kind of like the idea of bogarting
I'm pretty
areas.
staunch in my ethics. So.
Just like just the thought process behind someone who's developing a crag, developing a route. At what point do you feel like it's appropriate to release to the public? If so at all? And what are your kind of thoughts behind that whole process and turning something you've created basically from private to public?
Yeah, okay. I'll answer that and I'll dive a little deeper into that as
Sounds
well,
great.
okay? So obviously this sport has a lot of like very staunch ethics ingrained into it. And even as popular as it's getting, everybody still holds pretty true to them. And you do hear of and read about some shenanigans, and it usually comes down to developing new areas and people not agreeing with it and going like, nope, that's getting chopped, or wow, this guy's chipping and gluing a lot of different routes in an area that isn't acceptable. Um, Things of that nature, right? Okay. Me personally, I was very against bolting for a very long time, and I like have always been very strict with like the original ethics written up by Earl Robbins and essentially the white hats of the golden age, right? And that's why we went to clean climbing and stopped hammering pitons. And you should never, as Earl Robbins puts it, you should never take away from the rock to bring it to your level. Even if you can never rise to that occasion in your lifetime, that doesn't mean that a future generation won't. And you're immediately robbing them of ever having that pure adventure for themselves because you're being selfish, okay? And you want your glory. So my mindset has always been, and I am not proud to say this, but at this point I have placed probably over 1,000 bolts. Okay. And I haven't done that many sport routes. A lot of them were more ground up, like kind of core to those ethics, like ground up drilling traditional routes where it's like, I'm going to get as much gear as I can. Wow, this run out is not realistic. Like I need to place a bolt. Okay. But even with that, the way I would usually approach it and still do, and especially like I live close to a very popular sport area now that I think maybe a very small fraction of the overall potential of the place has been bolted into a sport destination. Um, it is acceptable there, and I do place a lot of bolts there. So even in that application, I, if I can, will access it from above, especially if it's 511 or harder. And we work it into submission and we clean it. And, and when I say we, it is usually a collective process. So, if you see any of my contributions, let's say on Mountain Project, which will segue into like one form of sharing it and when and why, I don't ever give me or any of my friends credit for doing the FA. It's kind of this generic crew. So it's like any climb you see that I've contributed and it says the FA party was the Alpine Monkeys, that is me and whatever group of friends, right? And that was another way to take the ego out of it. Or some climbs, it'd be a year process is what I'm getting through. And I would have a dozen different friends, even from the area or visiting. I'll check this out. Oh no, that bolt, we do a tick mark. That's not in the right place. Okay. Then I think about it for a year before I go back and actually put the bolts in. And in that year, things will usually change. We were like, no, it needs another bolt, or no, we could like ditch half of them that we originally thought we needed. And then obviously, whenever you can place gear, it's like I really don't like to put a bolt. And even if it's like, oh, it's a sport route and it's 13 clips, but there's one spot I can get a cam, I'll leave that. And if somebody is a sport climber, then they're just going to be forced to do a little bit more of a run out.
I think personally for me, like, maybe it's being like this like newer generation and stuff. I think it depends. Like obviously if there's like a nice splitter granite crack that just eats gear and like someone's like
for sure
drilling bolts into that, you're sitting there going like, okay, like why? But like a good example would be like Guaranteed Rugged. I don't know if you saw that post on Mountain Project and other things on Instagram. It's like it just got bolted. It's really close to here actually. In BC, it's like a 33 pitch route.
Yeah,
one of the
it's like they say it's the longest route. Yeah.
It's like
that's a great example.
Unreal, amazing example, and that's still like
and obviously
33 pitches is still full on. So, but I think what it does is it gives the sport of climbing access to people who maybe wouldn't have gone and done some insane Chaussee alpine route now it's like they
For
can
sure.
maybe actually have this goal of like, hey, this is a bolted route. It's still full on. It's still route finding, loose rock, the whole 9 yards, and 33 pitches in a day that's a lot of climbing. You got to know your
It's a
stuff.
big day. And
But
so
at the very
obviously with
least, like, you
that,
have this entry, right, where you can get in and you can kind of do this. And so I'm a proponent personally of like when I hear and see things like that, I'm like, fuck yeah,
that's
the
awesome.
entry to do
Yeah,
stuff
yeah.
like that is so great. So yeah, I just
So
thought I'd
with
toss
that
in.
said, not everybody ever cares to get into trad climbing, right? It's like they're happy sport climbing. And that's amazing to be able to like up that ante for those individuals a little bit more. Obviously, like with the route you're talking about, there's different rock types involved. And even if like maybe you get a piece of gear, that's just the ethos of the area, whatever it is, it's like, yeah, turn it into a sport route, right?
Yeah.
Me personally, like I do that at sport areas, but like I said, it's more of a process. And even the route you're just talking about, guaranteed that was not an easy affair. And it took those guys a long time and a lot of hard work. And who knows how many partners.
Totally. Yeah.
And I don't know
It's a
if
full-on
they wrapped into it. They did it from the ground up, probably a little bit of both. They're not doing that on like a whim in like a week, even, let's say.
No, absolutely.
Right?
That's
No,
a monumental
and
project. Yeah.
at least not if they are doing it properly. So then, I think a big part of that, and we'll come back to finishing answering some of your questions, Kyle, goes back to what I was starting to mention earlier a while back, is like, for me, like I guess I could consider myself this like staunch trad climber. I don't like to give it any label. For me, it's just all climbing, and I love any forms of it. But as I saw, like, you could say a big wall or a big wall alpine or just any big alpine objective being the pinnacle of it. For me, all other pursuits that were under that were stepping stones that were all merely practice to get me to that pinnacle of it all, right? Originally, I never cared to climb big walls. That scared the shit out of me. I was like, no, I could see that's a lot of suffering. I'm like, hell no. Ice climbing, hell no. I didn't like being cold. I worked on a ski resort for 2 years. I'm like, fuck. And it all came out of necessity, that it's like, if you want to be well-rounded to go do those big pinnacle objectives, you have to learn how to do it all and do it all safely and competently, right? And then that goes back into even developing new routes and recognizing what you're going to do in what style and what application, and that will make the most sense to help set up future generations for success, and not make it like routes that we've done, which I love. We're like, man, that route is so bold, and those guys were so awesome that did this back in the day for why they did it and how they did it. But it's a death route. Like, who wants to repeat that?
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a balance, to be found there, and you go back and forth a little bit depending on the rock type, the areas, the history of the area, so on and so forth. But then, as far as when it gets to the finished product, right? And like, that is a huge part of the creative process. It's like, when is this actually ready? What are we going to name it? Right? What number do we want to give to it? How are we going to go about and share this to where it does inspire more people than turn them off to be like, yeah, I want to go do that, right? Or even maybe not even in my lifetime, like I said. So personally, the way I've always gone about it is that year process of whether it needs bolts or not, and lap it as many times as you can. And like, for instance, the climb that you and I shared together, Kyle, and Kyle got the second ascent of that has only been repeated a couple times now, but I didn't share it for probably 2 years after I had done it. It took me 9 sessions up that thing, and then going and lapping it with a couple friends, Kyle being one of them, before I was like, well, that's as close as it's going to get a share this one. Okay. Part of maybe keeping like amazing hidden gems that you found secret to yourself, yeah, that's cool maybe for a while, but eventually it's like the word's going to get out, and like, you should, if you're doing it for the right reason, you should be cognizant or recognize that it will get to the point where it's like, okay, I'm ready to move on, and I do feel comfortable with sharing this with everybody now.
And I think
Right?
you should be happy about the
You
sharing,
should be proud about it.
proud
And
and
especially like I
happy
said,
about
if
the
you're doing it,
success.
if you're doing it for the right reasons, why wouldn't you be?
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
And that, you it does give you tough skin. There are a lot of critics out there. And what I've always come back to, and I think it holds true to everything, not just in climbing, that if in your heart of hearts, you're doing things for the right reason, then what the fuck does it matter what the naysayers say in the peanut
Mhm.
gallery, right? Yeah.
On the Mountain
Um,
Project forums.
I mean, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I obviously, like, I'm very active on Mountain Project, and
Yeah.
I like, unfortunately, I have to go through and filter a lot of the nonsense, which that's nothing I ever like signed up for, but
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, a lot of it is just unnecessary negativity, and it's like, yeah, this
Yeah.
doesn't need to be on there,
Yeah, I mean, we could dive
So
into a
then
rabbit hole for that, but we'll skip
we
it.
could, yeah, right. We won't go there. And so yeah, for me, it's like 1 to 2 years and lapping it as many times as possible, cleaning up as much as you can, making it as safe as possible more than anything, right? And and what's funny is, like, part of that process is like your FA on site mentality is versus when you get it dialed and cleaned. Originally you're like, fuck, this is so hard. Oh my God, it's so out of my comfort zone. And then you rehearse it and a bunch of friends do it, and you're like, yeah, it's actually like way easier. But then you have to be careful there, because then you're like, yeah, okay, this is the on-site FA rating versus this is what the general consensus is. And then everybody now is like, dude, Josh, you're the worst sandbagger imaginable. And I'm like, no, man, like, you guys are all soft, and this is the process. So, like, this wasn't just me that came up with this number, like, if anything, I agree. And then, yeah, we sometimes take it a step further depending on the area, where it's like, okay, we all agree, let's say this is 510 plus, and we'll call it 510A, right? But then
Okay.
people will catch on immediately. It's like, well, all this guy's 510As are all 510 pluses. And I'll even hint around about that. But that's a whole another story, as far as
So
like,
why do you approach it that like that? Why do you set them
um
harder than they technically are?
because that's just always been part of the history of developing routes. And inflation versus sandbagging is both of them you could interpret as like that's feeding into your ego. But what are the worst of the two evils, I guess you could say. Yeah,
Okay.
like, I'd rather be like, no, this is weak and soft, and someone coming along and go, it's weaker and softer, than someone come along and be like, no, there's like the I guess what I'm getting at is come along and be like, no, it's a little harder, versus come along and be like, dude, this is way easier than you're saying it is. And like, now you're feather bagging everything, right? Yeah. And people, I think, as the sport progresses, and it's like you hear it with like the traditional places, like, oh, that place is so sandbagged. It's like, no, that's accurate. Everywhere you're getting used to climbing, in particular in a gym, that is all tremendously soft.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's a whole history lesson as to like, some of those old routes are a little sandbagged, but that wasn't intentional by any means.
Yeah.
I
Versus, yeah,
think
you can maybe
ultimately at the
argue.
end of the day, like, grading's subjective, you should
It's
never
so
be like, oh,
subjective.
I've climbed a
Yeah.
10A, I can
And
climb this 10A. It's like,
yeah,
maybe this 10A is the worst stylistically for you ever, and
for
it's
sure.
run out, and it's also like route finding, and it's totally sustained, and instead of being the average 20-meter pitch, it's like 70 meters. It's like taking that subjectivity, it's bad.
Historically, it is so subjective, and that's why, like, I don't even like applying numbers. I will intentionally be a little more generic about it. And then it's like, yeah, people can drop all the comments they want, and all agree differently.
Yeah.
But But really, like, historically, it's like when guys started developing routes after the YDS was developed, they all based it off of the first 5.9, the open book, right? But that was them basing off of them doing it 2
It's a
years
hard
ago.
5.9.
It is, and they'd grown a lot as a climber in 2 years, thinking back to like, is this route we just did easier or harder than the open book? Well, obviously they'd gotten way better, especially in their mind's eye, as to how they remember how scary and hard the open book was when they did it 2 years prior. And they're still like, well, no, it's not. It's not as proud as that 5.9. When in fact, they're like jumping into like 5.10 pluses. And then there's a little back and forth with that, with a lot of those classic areas. And then also the argument to where it's like, no, like climbers, we've gotten as hard as we can. Climbing will never go beyond that. So forever the plateau was 512D, although there was a lot of 513s being developed and harder. And those are all sandbagged 513s, right? Like, and everyone's calling them 512Ds just because they
Yeah.
were like, no, that's as hard as it'll ever get. It'll never get any harder, And then
Yeah.
that would go on
Yeah.
for a 5-year period until someone's finally like, no, you know what? This
Okay.
is way harder. Like, okay, it's got to go up a letter grade, right? Yeah. And then
Yeah.
that's where you see
Interesting.
inflation come into place, right?
Yeah,
Where it's
that's
like, yeah,
interesting. I didn't
yeah,
really
yeah.
think about the evolution of the grades themselves and how they manifested it into the ratings themselves as these routes were being
For
established.
sure. And then to take it a step further, there's an evolution of the life of a route and how it can go from the FA rating, as I described, to what everybody generally agrees happens to where now it becomes sandbagged. And the reason being is,
Yeah.
yeah, the FA on site is always going to feel the hardest. But then the route goes through this evolution where it sees all this traffic, everything's cleaned up, and everybody's like, this is beautiful, everything's there. We all agree it's like this. But then holes will start breaking, everything starts to get polished, even though gear's getting better. And then everyone's like, no, this is way harder than what everybody agreed on.
Cool. Yeah, the last ones I feel like we should close with is just to give you a chance to talk about your climbing ranch
The
and
ranch,
a
yeah,
little bit
dude.
about a little bit about how that came about and kind of what your vision for it is in the future and how people, our audience especially, can help engage with what you've got going on.
Um, I think part of the theme that's developed over this conversation is expressing like, yeah, genuinely how much I do. I am very passionate about getting to share all of this. And then, through the years, finding those different stages and mediums in which to get to share this on. So on and off the rock. So, we mentioned guiding. And although one of the original motivations for getting into that was I just didn't want to do surfboards anymore. And I love being in the outdoors and I would make any sacrifice I could possibly think of to make that happen. It was more that all of those experiences that always meant so much to me wouldn't have if it wasn't for the people I got to share them with, right? So then it's like, what does it look like to do that to a greater capacity? And one of which is guiding. Okay. Working at a gear shop, as you mentioned, Kyle, like that was something like I did early on to help balance college life, but then fell in love with it. I'm like, man, like even before I got to the point that I am now, like I had sold hundreds of pairs of climbing shoes and hundreds of racks and trying to inspire people even at that early level just by working at a retail front, slinging gear, right? And mountain shops in Southern California aren't really a thing. So I felt pretty fortunate to be at this like unique time and place and getting to do that. Um, Developing new routes, helping contribute those routes into guidebooks. And, I'm one of the top all-time contributors on Mountain Project now. Um, I work at a gear shop again, which is like my perfect dream of what a mountain shop should be like. I finally found it, and it's the third mountain shop I've worked at. And then for 3 years, I was a technical advisor for Petzl and for Scarpa. So that was like an amazing stage to be on. And like, man, your audience was so broad. I was like, wow, this is a dream come true. And those companies take such good care of their employees. So I was on a 5-year contract for them. And when COVID started, they did not renew my contract, which it's okay because it led me down the path that I was initially going down. And so what had happened with that to paint a little bit more of a picture for the folks out there is I was guiding a lot further and further away from the family, and it was very hard to be away from them, sometimes like 3 weeks to a month at a time. And I'd come back and I'd be like, man, they put me up in an Airbnb. Like, you guys could have all gone with me. Or, yeah, I was going into the backcountry 2 or 3 times, but coming out to this trailhead where I had this amazing base camp. Like, I know you guys didn't want to hang out for a month there waiting for me to come out periodically in a tent. But if we had like a little small travel trailer, that'd be cool. My wife's like, yeah, but like, that doesn't really fit into our balance right now. And then I'm like, well, what if we just got rid of everything? Like, our kids are young enough. Like we could go on the road and do that. Maybe one of us could start working remotely to help there. And my wife's like, no, you're high. Like, what a pipe dream. And I'm like, no, it'd be cool. They're like, you can't argue, you know? And sure enough, after about a year of like thinking about that more and more seriously, we did commit and we sold. We were, in a sense, living what I would like to call this very false American dream, where we had a nice house in San Diego County and we had 2 cars and pets and everything seemed perfect. But it sucked sitting in traffic and being away from the family. And I just wanted to be closer to the mountains. And so my wife was in agreement finally, and it took us a year to sell everything we had, get rid of our 2 cars, and unfortunately have to upgrade to a truck that would pull said trailer. And we bought a little 20-foot travel trailer. And so that kind of like 5-year pipe dream almost actually manifested itself as a reality within like 2 or 3 years. But part of why that became more realistic was I got this gig with Petzl and Scarpa on top of being able to guide. So I was like, oh, and I had 300 accounts on the West Coast. I'd have to travel to each of them once a year. But then there was 5 climbing festivals that I would go to once a year, and that was extremely fun. And I mean, like I said, the stage to get to share all of this in those venues was magical, and made a lot of good friends. Obviously, the networking is amazing. Part of the way I'd gotten into that, it literally like kind of fell into it, was I have just been in this industry so long and made so many connections that there was just like this small window for opportunity. And my buddy's like, dude, it's yours if you want it. I'm like, you'd be insane if you said no to that, especially in my circumstances at the time, right? And so we traveled for about 3 years, and a big part of what started to happen through that process was this like long-term pipe dream I had, which would be to someday own a guide service, um, and get to share it to that extent. That had manifested itself through a really close friend of mine with like almost the business model I had envisioned to the T. And so that's the main guided service that I represent now, which is Golden State Guiding. Hi, Ryan. And so that was covered. So I'm like, well, what's the next obvious step? And I'm like, man, these climbing festivals are rad. Like, what would it look like to be able to put this on? So I become really close with uh Paul Fish, who is the owner of a very famous mountain shop in Spokane. And he is the one who has always put on the Red Rocks Rendezvous. And then without getting too much into it, it's very interesting. The Red Rocks Rendezvous spawned out of the longest standing climbing festival in the US that was called the Phoenix Bouldering Comp, even though it wasn't held in Phoenix, by this legendary Joshua Tree couple. And I was like, wow, like what a cool concept. And they just did it purely out of the love of getting to share and bring the community together. And we know like what climbing festivals have turned into, especially with like the AAC's Cragging Classics. Like they do a really good job. And so, we're exploring all these mountainous regions, and I'm kind of thinking of that. And part of it was maybe in hopes to find some other mountains that I could fall in love with more than the Sierras, which is where I currently live. There are some spectacular mountains throughout North America. They're all really unique in their own way. They all have their own personality and characteristics, but I kept coming back here. And especially from a guide standpoint, like it's a great position to be in here right now. Um, and but property is cheaper elsewhere. Like it's expensive to live in California, and we were saving a lot of money being on the road, but I couldn't see like being able to really ever afford property in California. And so we're starting to look at some of these other mountainous regions, and then we're like, yeah, like okay, like 5-year pipe dream from there turned into like, let's settle down, we have money saved, and try to start a climbing ranch, which is essentially a private campground that is like climber centric, right? There have been some very successful climbing ranches. The most historic one in that is still in existence in the US is the Teton Climbing Ranch. And that was essentially inherited by the AAC many years ago. and they do a pretty good job, but um, it's somewhat private, you could say. It's not really, but it's a totally different business model than like what we had come up with, right? So the business model that we came up with, which I'm not going to bore you with too much, it didn't work in every mountainous region. It worked in a few places. So like Todd Gordon, who I'm pretty close with, my cousin, who's the only other climber in my family, lived with Todd for 18 years and developed a bunch of routes in Joshua Tree. So Todd did something pretty similar with what we're trying to do here in Joshua Tree, but has always kind of kept it on the DL. And now it's like, it's not even the Gordon Climbing Ranch really anymore. He would word that differently than I am, but in a nutshell, there's the Waco Rock Ranch is pretty successful. Obviously everybody knows of Miguel's in the red. And none of those though are quite as old as obviously the Teton Climbing Ranch. And then there have been several that have come and then just fallen to the wayside. But then internationally, they are gaining a lot of momentum. So like one there that comes to mind that's been really popular for a while now is this German couple started one. I have a hard time remembering the name, but it's in Laos. So it's a really popular destination if you're in Thailand to skip over to their jungle retreat and have full amenities and get to climb your brains out. And if you're traveling, they have gear for you to use. You can hire them as a guide service. So I'm like, yeah, from a sharing standpoint on a grand scale, to me, that was kind of the pinnacle of all of this. And it's something that like I personally, like as far as some shortcomings I talked about as I evolved through all of this and it all worked out, that was like the least likely thing I would have ever dreamed of having kind of come to life. Even though it's something that we've been working towards, given the timeline I just laid out. And so when we finally, our business model where it worked brilliant was in this valley, Red Rocks, it would work amazing, and in Joshua Tree. But I really wanted to do it here because we're only 2 hours from Joshua Tree, 2 hours to Red Rocks, and 2 hours to Yosemite. I'm like, this is more centralized. The numbers all made sense as far as like it's a very tourist-based economy here, and it attracts millions of tourists a year. And then not only that, it didn't happen immediately when we committed to doing it here, but they just came up with a lot of new rules and regulations that limit a lot of the public camping that has always drawn climbers, especially to this valley. So it set us up perfectly. And we start looking into it. It's kind of interesting little history lesson with this valley that LA owns 98% of it, right? So if you're familiar with the stretch of the 395 up the Owens Valley, it's a lot of open public land. There's national forests, there's BLM, but then there's all this vastness that's empty, and it kind of looks like it's ranches. That is all LADWP, and it is a tough story to share as to why they own all of this land. But with that said, so there's 2% that's privately owned, and then out of that 2%, none of it is open raw land, let alone that you have water rights because LA owns it all, and then let alone that it's open zoning to be able to have said business. So I'm like, man, even though this place makes the most sense for our business model, things weren't looking good when we started first really looking and we had the money to throw down. So we're kind of like thinking Joshua Tree or Red Rocks. And Bishop was like where I originally wanted to do it. And that was definitely not on the table. And then like kind of, it wasn't that we had given up on this valley. We're like, something will come up, and we have like one main realtor in particular who's keeping our feelers out, but everyone's telling us like, there's no way. And so very coincidentally, and, as far as like maybe more affirmation as to like believing in the universe manifesting itself in ways you would never imagine, we randomly, learn of this pioneer cemetery I'd never known about growing up here, because that is where the very first, it's two brothers and their best friend. They were the very first ones to ever summit Whitney. And it was kind of this interesting race by all the geologists trying to be the first ones to the top. And they were all overshooting it and summiting nearby peaks. And these three locals were kind of like, all these damn geologists that like should know what they're doing, and they go and they're the first ones to summit. So I find out they're buried in this pioneer cemetery, and we go and visit it, and it's this beautiful, surrounded by this um riparian rehabilitation area, to where they're trying to bring it back to the original state that it looked like wet grasslands 100 years ago. And me and my wife and kids are like, yeah, this cemetery is a little creepy and old, but this is neat history. And like, why can't we find a piece of property like this would be perfect? And even if we could, like, it's not going to be open zoning, and we won't have water rights. The water rights is a different thing, but the open zoning was a big thing. And that night, my wife gets an email for this property that had been listed for a few months now, but even our realtor didn't know about it. And it was literally the property we had just been talking about that earlier in the day off of the cemetery. And we put an offer in on it the next day and got it. And so what our envisionment here is, we have just under 13 acres, more or less right on the Owens River. From the get-go, I'm like, this is the best view I've ever seen in this valley from being on the valley floor. And I'm like, maybe that's a little biased, but everybody that comes is like, dude, this is the most unique view. And it is like, our property, it has very unique energy. And there's some other historical things I could go on about as to why it probably has such unique energy. Um, but yeah, so we got our business license, did all of that. We're in the process of having the name trademarked, which is the Mount Whitney Climbing Ranch. Um, we put some really tight, um, let me rephrase that. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves when we first got the property. That was like, hey, okay, like all these marketing pushes before we're even open, but to build up interest and momentum. And then we'll do a soft launch in a year. We should be up to par with like working with the planning department and all of the phasing out of the project within a year. And that was the end of 2019, and then COVID happened. And so we had a
Yeah.
decent amount of yeah, we had a decent amount of savings, you know, to be able to put into the business and have it open in a year. But we spent, like, I didn't have work for a year, neither did my wife. Obviously, like I mentioned, my contract with Petzl and Scarpa was not renewed. And it was like, okay, well, it's kind of a blessing in disguise. Like, we want it to happen more organically and not force it. And we had to survive off of that cushion for a year. And now we're kind of back to scratch. So the neat thing is, I mean, I got an amazing deal on the property, and a lot of that had to do with being very honest with the sellers as to what we're trying to do. And they're an older family from this valley, and they loved it, and they cut the price way down, and they're like, it's yours. And it's on a 5-year loan. So we're like halfway through having it paid off. So the idea right now, without getting into the nitty gritty too much, is I'll be able to pull out a significant developmental loan. I could do it now, but I'm kind of trying to, like I said, let it happen a little more organically. And when I don't have my current overhead in place, because I'll have that paid off in some other things, and be able to dump it all into the business then, and have what I would like to think is a very unique, very friendly, positive, family friendly atmosphere for climbers to stat if they're passing through. Really, all outdoor user groups, right? And there are 12 that use this immediate area pretty heavily, and they don't all overlap. So that's some interesting dynamics. But we've gotten, pretty much, I would say, the general consensus of the immediate climbing community has met the whole process with more open arms than I would have ever imagined, or at least what I would have hoped for, And we are currently, like, unofficially opened, so it's kind of dry camping right now, and we're letting friends and family come stay here whenever they want. And we have started to do our own climbing festival. So we did one last year that was really small. We're doing a much bigger one in the fall time, and we call that Bama Days. And it's neat this year because we will have like a vendor village, and I have like basically name a vendor or company in the outdoor industry. They're all coming to help support it. Our guide service has always had a beer sponsor. So it is currently Pure Brewing, which is one of the only carbon neutral breweries, microbreweries in North America. And so they're going to supply all the beer as they do for all of us guides. It's kind of neat to have a beer sponsor, especially a very ethical oriented beer sponsor. And, as far as like, we more than all of that, like what we're trying to show is that there is this alternative lifestyle that everyone can live in our day and age that is way simpler and way more minimalistic, and we don't have the carbon imprint mess to clean up that all of the generations, like my parents' generation, I'll say in particular, have left us with. It has become very hard. We are one of the only properties, even in the continental US, let alone like California is really strict, that you cannot live off the grid. So they've made it hard for people even to want to live a simpler, cleaner lifestyle, right? But we've based all of our business model off of that, and to show that it's possible. And not only from this grand of a standpoint, I would say, but the fact that like I did it with my family in a trailer for 4 years, right? And it was pure bliss. Like my kids did not know people lived in houses and did not walk daily in the mountains and go take a river bath until we settled down. And I was like, wow, how unique, and they're extremely pure from that, being exposed to that at such a young age. What, twice as Huckleberry Finn as I ever was, even. And so then, yeah, we think that it's important to stress that with the community, but like from the guide service standpoint, it's the same thing. We're 1% from the planet. We try to offset everything we do as much as possible because we think that's super important to keep our wild places wild, or as they would say it in Hawaii, keep the country, right? So I'll end it on that rant. I hope that answered your question.
You
Yeah.
did. Perfect. It was well executed description.
I think that's a perfect place to kind of end it and
End
to
it
come
there,
full
yeah.
circle on this conversation and stuff. And but yeah, I just think in general, like Josh, like between your first ascents, being so open, your mentorship, sharing your stories, your climbing ranch here, your environmental ethics. I just want to say, like, I think what you're doing is awesome. Thanks so much for coming on the show, taking the time to come talk to us. I really mean it. I'd love to share a rope with you anywhere in Canada when you come.
Yeah,
Please don't hesitate to reach out.
It would be cool for all three of us to hang out sometime.
For sure, man. And so, do you want to just repeat the name of the ranch and how people can, like, if they are interested in looking you up or contacting you?
Oh no,
what
I
are those
appreciate it, and I'll obviously help try to promote you guys as much as possible as well, as I have already been doing. So it is the Mount Whitney Climbing Ranch. You can visit our website. It gives a little more detail as to what I was just explaining on there. And then we also have an Instagram. I'm guilty of not maybe being more, having more of a presence on social media. I do feel it isn't necessarily evil. I don't love social media, but I don't hate it. And I have finally come to terms that it is another beautiful way to get to share a lot of this. And so the ranch's page, it's fun. It's nothing serious. It's a reflection, I think, of our lifestyle, really.
And is that the Mount Whitney Climbing Ranch on Instagram?
Yes. Yeah.
That's what it is, Mount Whitney Climbing Ranch on Instagram? Awesome, man.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I'll go give you guys a follow and check that out.
For sure. Thank you guys so much for having me. And, I have a lot more to share. And as I mentioned to you before, which we did not talk about this episode, is I love storytelling. I think it is a very underappreciated lost art. And, I have a lot of really fun stories that I'd love to share with you guys further. So,
Josh, I feel like this is
keep
the
that in
first
mind.
of several times we're going to be talking to you on this show, hopefully.
Of course. Yeah, I know. And hopefully you guys get good feedback and you're not like, nope, everybody hated that. Like, you can't be back on
it. No, I mean, this will be our longest one. So we'll see what the people say. But we loved it.
Well,
totally. And I think that's part of the thing about like this community, right? It's like,
Yeah.
like this is exactly, there's so many people who share our ideals and visions and the way we think. So yeah.
No, and I think if it's like the three of us, it's like I cannot consume enough of like everything I can get my hands on in regards to like any of this stuff, right? So it's listening to podcasts, all the books I can read, all the YouTube videos I can watch. I mean, Kyle's done an amazing job with his YouTube videos, which has been awesome to watch that
Totally.
evolution. And I'm excited to see where you guys go with all of this. So yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I will say
Absolute pleasure,
namaste.
Josh, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, to you as well, my friend. To you and
Yeah,
your family.
we'll be in touch. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, you guys have a great
absolutely,
evening
man.
and talk to you soon, okay?